Music, the allegory of the cavern, the allegory of the cavern of Plato, is one of the most famous philosophical metaphors that illustrates how human beings perceive reality and the struggle to reach true knowledge. Imagine a dark cavern where prisoners are chained since birth, unable to move their heads. Behind them, there's a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, objects are carried that project shadows on the wall of the cavern. The prisoners, who have never seen anything else, mistake these shadows for reality. For them, a shadow in movement is a book of which they know nothing of the real world outside of the cave. One day, a prisoner is freed and dragged outside. At the beginning, the light of the sun blinds him. He struggles to accept that the objects that he now sees, trees, animals, the sky, are more real than the shadows that he previously believed were the totality of existence. With time, he realizes the truth. The world outside the cave is vast and full of genuine forms, while the cave was an illusion. If he returns to free the others, it is possible that they will not believe him. They could even resist, preferring their familiar but false world. Plato uses this story to illustrate the difference between appearance and reality. Most people live in ignorance, confusing perceptions with truth. The trip outside the cave represents enlightenment, learning to see beyond illusions. It is a painful but necessary process, revealing that wisdom requires freeing oneself from comforting but deceptive beliefs. The ship of Tuz is a mental experiment that challenges our understanding of identity and change throughout time. Tuz, a legendary Greek hero, was the owner of a great wooden ship during many years that began to rot, for what they were substituted one by new ones. In the end, all parts of the ship had been substituted. The question then arises, is it still the same ship? Now imagine that all the original boards were carefully saved and later used to reconstruct an identical ship. This leads to another question. Which is the true ship of Theseus? The one that was gradually substituted, or the one that was reconstructed with the original materials? This dilemma explores the nature of identity. If something changes slowly over time, but maintains continuity, is it still the same? This applies beyond the ships to the people, the objects, and even personal identity. Our bodies constantly replace cells, but we consider ourselves the same person for decades. But if the identity is tied to the physical continuity, does a reconstructed version of something count as the original? The ship of Theseus highlights the fluidity of identity. The philosophers debate if things continue being the same when they are altered, or if the identity is tied to the sum of their parts in a determined moment. In the modern era, this mental experiment applies to the cloning of AI and even to the personal transformation. How much can we change before we stop being the same? The trolley problem. The problem of the tram is one of the most famous mental experiments of ethics, designed to challenge our moral intuitions about good and evil. An uncontrolled trolley races at full speed down a track, and if nothing is done, it will kill 5 people tied to the rails. You're standing next to a lever that can divert the trolley to another track where only one person is tied. The question is simple, but profoundly disturbing. Do you pull the lever and actively cause the death of one person to save 5, or do you do nothing and let the tram continue its way? At first sight, many argue that pulling the lever is the morally correct option, given that sacrificing one to save 5 follows a utilitarian approach that prioritizes the greater good for the greater number of people. However, others argue that pulling the lever makes you directly responsible for the death of one person, while doing nothing means that you have not caused any damage. You have simply allowed it to happen. This aligns more with deontological ethics, which emphasizes the inherent morality of actions instead of their consequences. The problem becomes even more complex with variations. Suppose that instead of a lever, you could stop the trolley by pushing a corpulent person from a bridge onto the tracks, using them as a human barrier. Many people instinctively reject this option, although the calculation is the same: 1 life for 5. This suggests that our moral judgments are not purely logical, but molded by deeply rooted emotional and ethical principles. The problem of the tram continues being a vital ethical dilemma. especially in the modern debates about the autonomous cars, the military decisions, and the medical ethic. Determinism versus free will. The debate between determinism and free will is one of the oldest and deepest of philosophy that affects the core of human existence. Determinism is the idea that all events, including human actions, are dictated by prior causes. If the universe functions as a vast chain of cause and effect, then everything we do is simply the result of prior conditions. Our biology, environment, education, and even the laws of physics. If determinism is true, then free will is an illusion. We may feel that we are making decisions, but those decisions were already in motion long before we were aware of them. Free will, on the other hand, suggests that we have real control over our decisions, the capacity to choose between different options, to change our minds, and to act independently, meaning we are not simply products of destiny. Many argue that without free will, concepts like morality, responsibility, and justice lose their meaning. If someone had no choice but to commit a crime, could they be blamed for it? A middle ground is compatibilism. Determinism and free will can coexist. This perspective suggests that, although our actions may be influenced by external factors, we still have a significant level of choice. Even if certain factors determine our decisions, we are still the ones who make them. Modern science complicates this debate. Neuroscience suggests that our brain makes decisions even before we are aware of them, which points to determinism. However, at a human level, we experience life as if we freely make decisions. The question remains, do we have control, or are we following a script written by the universe? Existential anguish is the deep and disturbing feeling of anxiety or fear that arises when faced with the reality of human existence. That is the moment when you realize that life has no predetermined meaning, that the universe is indifferent to your struggles, and that you alone are responsible for creating purpose in your life. This concept is fundamental in existentialist philosophy, especially in the works of thinkers such as Søren Kierkegaard, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Martin Heidegger. Kierkegaard described it as the vertigo of freedom, the understanding that, unlike a stone or tree, you're not limited by inherent purpose, but must choose your own path, and with that freedom comes the responsibility of making the right decisions. For Sartre, existential anguish or nausea arises when we face the absurdity of existence. Why are we here? Why does anything matter? We yearn for validation, but we are alone in our decisions. There is no cosmic plan to guide us, only the weight of our decisions. This understanding can feel paralyzing. Some try to escape by clinging to religious dogma, social expectations, or distractions. But existentialists argue that the only true answer is to embrace the freedom to create meaning through an authentic life and act with full responsibility for one's own existence. Although existential anguish can be disturbing, it is also liberating, as it forces us to stop waiting for life to happen to us and, instead, to actively shape it, instead of seeing the uncertainty of life as a curse. We can see it as an opportunity to define ourselves, to live with intention, and to make every moment count. Nihilism is the philosophical belief that life has no inherent meaning, value, or purpose. It rejects the idea of an objective moral order, a divine plan, or an ultimate truth governing existence. If nothing has meaning, then everything, including morality, culture, and aspirations, is a human construct. This idea was famously explored by Friedrich Nietzsche, who proclaimed that God is dead. He did not mean it literally, but that the traditional sources of meaning, religion, morality, and absolute truths were losing their power in the modern world. With this collapse, humanity faced a crisis. Without these structures, where do we find meaning? For Nietzsche, nihilism was dangerous, yet also an opportunity. He warned against passive nihilism, where people sink into despair and meaninglessness. Instead, he advocated for an active nihilism, a bold rejection of imposed values in favor of creating one's own through strength and self-improvement. Nihilism comes in many forms. Moral nihilism holds that the concepts of good and evil are subjective and arbitrary. Epistemological nihilism questions whether we can really know anything. Existential nihilism, the best-known form, asserts that life is itself meaningless. Critics of nihilism argue it leads to despair, hedonism, or inaction. If nothing matters, why bother? Others, however, see it as an opportunity for radical freedom without a predetermined purpose. We are free to define our own path, to live authentically, and create our own values. Whether nihilism is a curse or a blank canvas for personal meaning depends on how each person chooses to respond to it. Solipsism is the philosophical idea that only one's own mind is certain to exist. Everything else, people, objects, even the entire universe, could be an illusion that only exists within your consciousness. If you have ever wondered, what if I am the only real person and everyone else is just a projection of my mind? You have hit the core of solipsism. Solipsism questions if we can know that anything beyond our experience is real. After all, everything you perceive, the colors, the sounds, the sensations, only exists within your mind in the form of neural signals. You have never directly experienced the world. You only experience your mind's interpretation. If this is the case, what proof is there that anything external exists? If this is the case, what proof is there that anything external exists? Philosophers like René Descartes struggled with this dilemma. His famous statement, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, was an attempt to ground certainty in at least one undeniable truth. The thinking self must exist, but beyond that, how do we prove the existence of anything else? Descartes ultimately invoked God as a guarantee that reality is not deception. Others, like George Berkeley, argued that existence depends on perception. Things exist because they are perceived by us or a higher being. Solipsism is a disturbing but fascinating idea. If taken to the extreme, it could lead to an isolated way of thinking. After all, if nothing else is real, why worry about anything? However, most people reject solipsism in practical life, assuming that the external world exists, even if we can never prove it with certainty. The problem of evil is one of the most difficult questions in philosophy and theology. If there is an all-powerful, omniscient, and good God, why does evil exist? This dilemma has preoccupied thinkers for centuries. If God is omnipotent, he could eliminate evil. If he is omniscient, all-knowing, he would be aware of all suffering. If he is all-benevolent, all goodness, he would want to prevent all suffering. However, the world is full of pain, injustice, and cruelty. How can this be reconciled? There are several classic answers for this problem. One is the defense of free will, arguing that God allows evil because true free will requires the possibility to choose evil. If human beings were incapable of evil, they would not be truly free. Another argument is the theodicy of soul-making, which suggests that suffering and difficulties exist to help human beings grow morally and spiritually. Without struggle, there would be no development of resilience, compassion, or courage. Some take a different approach and claim that human understanding is too limited to grasp divine justice. What seems to us as senseless suffering could serve a higher purpose beyond our understanding. Others argue that evil is necessary to contrast with good. Without darkness, would we truly appreciate the light? Atheists and skeptics, however, argue that the enormous amount of suffering in the world, natural disasters, disease, and senseless violence make it unlikely that a benevolent God is in command. Some conclude that if a deity exists, it might not be omniscient, omnipotent, or perfectly good. The problem of evil remains a central challenge in the philosophy of religion, raising fundamental questions about suffering, morality, and the divine's nature. Whether it is seen as an argument against God or a test of faith depends on one's perspective. The paradox of the heap, also known as the Sorites paradox, is a logical puzzle that challenges our way of defining vague concepts, especially when a gradual change leads to an unclear distinction between one state and another. Imagine you have a heap of sand. If you remove a grain, is still a heap. If you remove another and another, it is still a heap. But what happens if we continue this process? At what moment does it stop being a heap and become a small pile or scattered grains? Conversely, if we start with a single grain of sand and add one at a time, when does it officially become a heap? This paradox applies to more than just sand. Let's think about baldness. If a man loses a hair, he is not bald, but if he keeps losing them, at some moment we begin to call him bald. Similarly, when does a fetus become a child? When does an old car become scrap? When does a child become an adult? The paradox of the heap highlights a fundamental question of human reasoning and language. Many concepts on which we rely daily, such as heap, rich, tall, or bald, are not clearly defined. The vagueness of these definitions gives rise to paradoxical situations. Some philosophers, such as those of the school of fuzzy logic, argue that truth is not always binary, true or false, but exists on a spectrum. Others propose that our language simply lacks the precision to resolve such paradoxes. This paradox forces us to question how we categorize our world. If we cannot determine exactly where transition occurs, does that mean our definitions are erroneous or that reality resists clear limits? Dualism versus monism. The debate between dualism and monism is one of the oldest and most fundamental in philosophy regarding the nature of reality and the relationship between the mind and the physical world. Dualism is the belief that reality consists of two fundamentally different substances: the physical body, brain matter, and the non-physical mind, consciousness or soul. René Descartes was one of the most famous dualists, arguing that the mind and body are separate but interact. He saw the mind as something immaterial, a thinking entity, while the body was simply a machine obeying physical laws. The problem, of course, is explaining how a non-physical mind could influence a physical body. If thoughts and decisions arise in an immaterial soul, how do they activate neurons and body movement? Monism, on the other hand, argues that everything is made of a single fundamental substance. There are two main types of monism: materialism and idealism. According to this view, everything, including thoughts and consciousness, arises from physical processes within the brain. What we call mind is just brain activity, neurons firing chemical reactions and electrical signals. Idealism argues that reality is entirely mental. Some philosophers, such as George Berkeley, argue that the physical world only exists as perceptions in our minds. There is no external material reality, only consciousness and experiences. Both positions have profound implications. If dualism is true, then consciousness could exist beyond the body, which opens the door to ideas such as souls or life after death. But if monism is correct, then everything we experience, from emotions to thoughts, is reducible to biology and physics. This debate remains unresolved. Neuroscience increasingly supports a materialist vision, showing how mental states correlate with brain activity. However, the hard problem of consciousness, that is, how subjective experience arises from physical processes, remains a challenge. Whether we are more than physical beings is a question that continues to shape philosophy, science, and even personal beliefs. Moral relativism is the philosophical view that morality is not absolute, but determined by cultural, historical, or personal perspectives. In other words, what is considered right or wrong depends on context. There is no universal moral truth that applies to all people at all times. This idea challenges moral absolutism, which holds that certain ethical principles are immutable and apply universally. For example, a moral absolutist might argue that murder is always wrong, regardless of situation. A moral relativist, however, would argue that moral judgments depend on circumstances. What one society considers immoral, another may consider acceptable or even virtuous. Cultural relativism suggests that morality is determined by social norms. Practices such as polygamy, the death penalty, or arranged marriage may be considered acceptable in some cultures, but unacceptable in others. Subjective relativism goes further and argues that morality depends on each individual. What is right for one person may not be right for another. Historical relativism considers how moral values change over time. For example, slavery was widely accepted in the past, but is now universally condemned. Critics argue that moral relativism can lead to ethical nihilism, the belief that morality is meaningless. Is meaningless if there is no moral standard better than another. Does that mean we cannot condemn genocide or oppression? Some philosophers, such as Immanuel Kant, argue that certain ethical principles must be universal to ensure justice and human dignity. Despite these criticisms, moral relativism remains an important perspective in debates about tolerance, ethics, and the diversity of human beliefs. It forces us to question whether our moral convictions are truly objective or simply a product of our upbringing. Tabula rasa, from Latin tabula rasa, is the philosophical concept that individuals are born without inherent knowledge or mental content, and that all knowledge comes from experience and perception. This idea is most associated with John Locke, who argued that the human mind begins as a blank slate and is formed entirely by external influences, such as culture and environment. The idea of tabula rasa has profound implications, as it suggests that human behavior is not predetermined by genetics, but is shaped by experience. This perspective influenced modern psychology, particularly behaviorism, which holds that people can be conditioned to behave in certain ways based on stimuli. It also underlies many ideas about education, which emphasize the role of learning and environment in shaping intelligence and character. However, modern science complicates this vision. Research in genetics and neuroscience suggests that some aspects of personality, intelligence, and even morality may be innate. Babies show preferences, emotional responses, and basic problem-solving skills long before they have had enough experience to learn them. This has led many to believe that human nature is a mixture of nature and nurture. Some traits are innate, while others are shaped by experience. Even so, tabula rasa remains a powerful metaphor for human potential. If we are shaped by experience, then education, culture, and personal choices have the power to transform us, regardless of whether we start as a blank slate or not. Our ability to learn and grow remains fundamental to being human. Experience the absurd. The absurd is the idea that human beings constantly seek meaning in a silent, indifferent, and ultimately universe devoid of inherent purpose. This concept, most famously explored by Albert Camus, describes the tension between our deep desire for understanding and the chaotic nature of existence. At the heart of the absurd is a contradiction. Human beings yearn for order, reason, and meaning, but the universe offers none. We seek purpose in religion, philosophy, and personal ambitions, but find no universal answer. This realization can be deeply disturbing and lead some to despair or nihilism. However, Camus rejected nihilism and argued that, instead of seeking external meaning, we should accept the absurd and live with full awareness. He used the myth of Sisyphus, a man condemned to push a rock uphill for all eternity, as a metaphor for human existence. Although Sisyphus's task is meaningless, Camus imagines him happy because he accepts his destiny and finds joy in the struggle. The absurd is not about hopelessness, but about liberation. It means that we are free to create our own meaning rather than relying on imposed belief systems. There is no cosmic script or grand design that controls our destiny. This can be terrifying, but it also offers radical freedom. Instead of seeking answers that do not exist, we can live fully embracing the fleeting moments of life and shaping our own purpose in the face of meaninglessness. The Eternal Return. The Eternal Return is a thought experiment proposed by Friedrich Nietzsche that challenges us to consider how we live our lives and what it means to embrace existence. The idea suggests that you will have to relive your entire life exactly as it happened, over and over for all eternity. Every joy, every sorrow, every mistake, and every triumph. Nothing would change, and there would be no escape. This idea forces us to ask a powerful question. If you had to relive your life infinitely, would you be able to say yes? Would you curse the idea, feeling trapped by regret and dissatisfaction? Or would you accept it, to live in such a way that you would willingly repeat your choices forever, and saw this as the ultimate test of how much a person affirms their own existence? If the idea of eternal return horrifies you, you may not be living in a truly authentic or satisfying way. Instead of suggesting that the universe literally repeats itself, and use the eternal return as a psychological and ethical challenge that forces us to ask ourselves if we are living a life that we would be willing to experience without end, instead of waiting for a future reward or fearing mistakes of the past. It demands that we embrace each moment fully, since the ideal response to this challenge is the love of destiny, to affirm life completely, to say yes to all experiences, even suffering, which is the highest form of strength. Eternal recurrence is not about fear, but about responsibility. If life has no external meaning beyond what we give it, then we must live in such a way that we would joyfully repeat our existence forever. Forever. The social contract theory is the idea that societies are formed through an implicit or explicit agreement between individuals and their governmental institutions. It suggests that people give up some personal freedoms in exchange for security, order, and benefits of living in a structured community. Without this agreement, life would be chaotic and governed solely by brute force. This idea is fundamental in political philosophy and has been explored by thinkers such as Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Hobbes believed that, in a natural state, a world without laws or government, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutal, and short. To escape this anarchy, people agree to obey a ruler or governing body, even if it means giving up some of their freedoms. On the other hand, Locke argued that the social contract exists to protect natural rights, such as life, liberty, and property. If a government does not protect these rights, the people have a right to rebel. Rousseau took a different approach, believing that true legitimacy is only achieved when people collectively participate in shaping the laws under which they live. In essence, social contract theory is about balance between individual freedom and social order. It asks how much control a government should have, what we owe each other as members of society, and when, if ever, it is justified to break the contract. This theory remains highly relevant in modern debates about justice, democracy, and human rights, as it underpins our understanding of governance, law, and citizenship. The veil of ignorance is a thought experiment proposed by philosopher John Rawls to determine what a truly just society would be. It challenges us to design a fair system without knowing where we would personally end up within it. Imagine that, before you are born, you find yourself behind a veil of ignorance that hides your future identity. You don't know if you will be rich or poor, man or woman, healthy or disabled, part of the majority or a marginalized group. Since you have no idea where you will end up in society, you must create rules that are fair to everyone. Would you design a world in which the rich had all the power and the poor suffered if there was a possibility that you would be born into poverty? Would you allow discrimination if you could end up in the discriminated group? R.S. argued that, under these conditions, rational people would choose principles of justice that would guarantee fairness for all. They would prioritize basic freedoms, equal opportunities, and protection of the most vulnerable, since they could end up among them. This leads to what he calls justice as fairness, a system that does not favor any particular group, but seeks to create an equitable society. The veil of ignorance remains a powerful tool for thinking about ethics and politics. It forces us to step outside our personal biases and consider what is fair from a truly neutral perspective. It is widely used in debates about economic inequality, healthcare, human rights, and social justice, as it offers a simple but profound way to assess the equity of any system. The Izzat problem, also known as Hume's guillotine, is a philosophical challenge introduced by David Hume that questions whether moral or prescriptive claims can be logically derived from factual or descriptive claims. Hume observed that many arguments about morality and ethics attempt to derive what should be done based on observations of how things are. For example, someone might argue that Since human beings have historically lived in hierarchical societies, they should continue to do so. However, Hume pointed out that there is a fundamental difference between stating a fact about the world and prescribing a moral norm. The fact that something is a certain way does not mean that it should be. This problem has profound implications for ethics. If we cannot logically derive moral principles from facts, where do our moral obligations come from? Are they purely subjective, or do they have an independent foundation? Some philosophers argue that reason alone cannot establish moral truths, while others try to bridge the gap through social contracts, human well-being, or religious doctrine. This problem forces us to carefully examine our ethical reasoning and reminds us that just because something is natural or traditional does not automatically make it right. Many moral arguments require further justification beyond simple observations about the world. This distinction remains a cornerstone of modern debates in ethics, law, and political philosophy, and urges us to think critically about whether our moral conclusions are logically justified. Hedonism is the philosophical belief that pleasure is the supreme good and ultimate goal of human life. It holds that what is morally right or valuable is determined by what provides the most pleasure and least pain. In essence, hedonism is based on the simple idea that happiness is the primary measure of a good life. Ancient Greek philosophers such as Epicurus advocated a refined form of hedonism that emphasized not only fleeting physical pleasures, but long-term tranquility and well-being. Epicurean hedonism suggests that true pleasure comes from a balanced life, free from unnecessary desires, fears, and pain. This contrasts with crude or extreme hedonism, which seeks immediate gratification regardless of consequences. On the contrary, critics argue that a purely hedonistic lifestyle can be superficial or self-destructive if pleasure is the sole objective. Does that mean we should avoid challenges, responsibilities, or sacrifices? Some philosophers, like Immanuel Kant, completely rejected hedonism, arguing that morality must be based on duty and principles, not only pleasure. Others, like John Stuart Mill, refined hedonism and turned it into utilitarianism, suggesting that the best actions are those that maximize the happiness of the greatest number of people instead of only that of the individual. Hedonism continues to be a powerful and controversial idea that raises questions about what gives meaning to life and whether pleasure alone is a sufficient measure of fulfillment. While hedonism encourages us to seek joy and avoid suffering, it also forces us to consider whether a life dedicated exclusively to pleasure is truly a life well lived. The Pascal's wager is a famous argument of the mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal that tries to justify the belief in God not through tests, but through a pragmatic analysis of costs and benefits. Instead of asking whether God exists, Pascal asks what is gained or lost by believing or not believing. It presents four possible outcomes. 1. If God exists and you believe, you get an infinite reward in heaven. 2. If God exists and you do not believe, you suffer an infinite loss in hell. 3. If God does not exist and you believe, you do not lose anything significant. For if God does not exist and you do not believe, you do not gain anything significant. Given that believing in God could result in an infinite reward, while not believing carries the risk of infinite punishment, Pascal argues that the rational choice is to believe, even if the probability of God's existence is uncertain, since the potential gain exceeds any possible loss. Critics question this argument in several ways. One objection is the problem of the many, the problem of gods. Pascal assumes a specific type of God, but what if another deity rewards disbelief? Others argue that belief must be based on truth, not self-interest, and that pretending to believe for a reward is not genuine faith. Some wonder if belief can even be a choice. Can one force oneself to believe simply because it seems beneficial? Despite these criticisms, Pascal's wager remains an influential argument in the philosophy of religion. It shifts the discussion from demonstrating God's existence to considering the consequences of belief and doubt, turning it into a pragmatic question more than a purely theological one. The cogito, I think, therefore I am, famous in René Descartes' philosophy, is one of the most fundamental affirmations of philosophy. It serves as definitive proof of existence and as a starting point for his method of doubt. Descartes set out to find absolute certainty by questioning everything he could doubt and realized that he could be deceived by his senses, deceived by dreams, or even manipulated by an evil demon that fed him false perceptions. If everything he perceived could be an illusion, how could he know anything with certainty? However, one thing was undeniable. The mere act of doubting meant that there was something that doubted, even if all external reality was an illusion. The experience of thinking was real. He came to the conclusion that, even in the most extreme skepticism, one fact remained beyond all doubt: his own existence as a thinking being. The cogito is significant because it establishes a basis for knowledge. It affirms that self-awareness is the first undeniable truth. However, critics argue that it assumes too much. Some wonder if the I and I think is justified. Perhaps thoughts exist, but does that necessarily mean there is a thinker? Others question whether Descartes truly proves existence beyond the mental realm. Despite these debates, cogito ergo sum remains a powerful starting point for epistemology. It is a reminder that however uncertain the world may seem, consciousness itself is the one thing we cannot doubt. The Euthyphro dilemma is a philosophical problem raised by Socrates in the Platonic dialogue Euthyphro, which questions the foundations of morality in relation to divine authority. The dilemma asks, is something good because the gods command it, or do the gods command it because it is good? If something is good simply because the gods command it, then morality becomes arbitrary. The gods could declare that murder or cruelty are morally good, and we would have no standard with which to question them, suggesting that morality is not based on any inherent truth, but simply on divine preference, which in theory could change at any time. On the other hand, if the gods command something because it is already good, then morality exists independently of divine authority. This means that even the gods must follow the moral truths that exist beyond them. However, this raises another problem. If morality is independent of divine will, then we do not need the gods to understand what is right and wrong. Morality would exist as a separate, objective system that human beings can discover through reason. This dilemma remains a fundamental question in the philosophy of religion and ethics, since it questions the idea that morality comes solely from divine command and suggests, instead, that moral reasoning must go beyond simple obedience to authority. Some religious philosophers try to resolve the dilemma by arguing that the very nature of God is inherently good, which means that his commandments are neither arbitrary nor external. However, for many, the Euthyphro dilemma remains an open question that forces a deeper reflection on the origins of morality. The golden mean. The golden mean is the Aristotelian concept of virtue as a balance between extremes. Instead of considering morality as a set of rigid rules, Aristotle believed that ethical behavior consists in finding the right balance between excess and deficiency. For example, courage is a virtue, but lack of courage is a defect, just as excess of courage, recklessness, is also harmful. Similarly, generosity is good, but being too stingy is selfish, while being too extravagant is wasteful. The key to an ethical life, according to Aristotle, is to develop the practical wisdom so that one recognizes where the balance is in any given situation. The golden mean is not about mediocrity or always choosing the middle ground, but about achieving harmony and self-control. It recognizes that virtues depend on context and that people must cultivate good habits to make balanced decisions. A person who is naturally shy may need to strive to be more daring, while someone naturally aggressive may need to cultivate patience. This idea has profound implications. Beyond personal ethics, it applies to leadership, relationships, and even politics. Extremes often lead to instability, while a balanced approach fosters long-term success. The golden mean encourages people to develop character and self-awareness instead of blindly following rigid rules. The ethical framework of Aristoteles remains influential today, shaping modern debates about virtue ethics, while other ethical systems focus on consequences or rules. The golden mean emphasizes moral growth and cultivating a virtuous and balanced life. The razor of AAM is a philosophical principle that states that the simplest explanation is often the best. It is a logical reasoning tool that suggests that, when faced with multiple conflicting explanations, we should prefer the one that makes fewer assumptions. This principle is named after the 14th century philosopher William of Ockham, who argued that unnecessary complexity in reasoning should be avoided. The idea is not that the simplest explanation is always correct, but that adding assumptions without evidence only increases the chance of error. For example, if you hear hooves outside, it is more reasonable to assume they come from a horse than a zebra, unless there are reasons to believe otherwise. Occam's razor is widely applied in science, philosophy, and everyday decision-making. In science, it helps formulate theories with the fewest assumptions, ensuring that they are testable and not unnecessarily complicated. For example, if two scientific models explain a phenomenon equally well, the one with fewer speculative elements is usually preferred. In medicine, it guides diagnosis. Doctors often look for common diseases before considering rare or exotic conditions. However, critics warn that simplicity alone does not guarantee truth, as reality sometimes is complex and the simplest explanation may overlook crucial details. Occam's razor, is best used as a heuristic, a guiding principle, rather than an absolute rule. It reminds us to be skeptical of unnecessary complications and prioritize clarity and evidence over speculation. The principle of sufficient reason states that everything that exists must have a reason or explanation for why it is so, and not otherwise. This principle, closely associated with the philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, states that nothing happens without a sufficient cause, reason, or explanation, even if we do not yet know what that reason is. This idea is fundamental in both metaphysics and science. For example, in physics, we assume that events have causes, even if these are hidden or difficult to discover. The principle also plays a role in logic and mathematics, where every statement or conclusion must be justified. The principle of sufficient reason leads to profound questions about existence itself. Why does the universe exist instead of nothing? Why are the laws of nature the way they are? Leibniz uses this principle to argue for the existence of God, stating that the universe must have a necessary reason for its existence, something beyond the physical world. Others have applied it to debates about determinism, arguing that if everything has a reason, then free will might be an illusion, since every action would ultimately be determined by prior causes. Despite its intuitive appeal, the principle has been questioned. Some argue that not everything needs a reason, that perhaps some events, such as quantum fluctuations, occur randomly without a clear cause. Others suggest that seeking explanations for everything can lead to an infinite regression in which each reason demands another reason, whether accepted or not. The principle of sufficient reason remains a powerful idea that underpins our way of understanding the world. It drives scientific research, philosophical debate, and our natural instinct to wonder why. The Gettier problem is a philosophical challenge to the traditional definition of knowledge that shows that a person can have a justified true belief without actually having knowledge. This problem, introduced by Edmund Gettier in 1963, shook the foundations of epistemology and forced philosophers to rethink what it means to know something. For centuries, knowledge was commonly defined as justified true belief, JTB. According to this definition, if you believe something, you have good reasons to support it, and it turns out to be true, then you know it. However, Gettier demonstrated that this definition is incomplete by presenting cases in which someone has a belief that is both justified and true, but still does not seem like knowledge. Let's consider an example. Suppose you have a friend, Sarah, who owns a red car. One day you see her driving a red car, so you conclude that Sarah has a red car. However, unbeknownst to you, Sarah sold her car the day before, and the car you saw her driving was a rental. Coincidentally, Sarah bought another red car that same morning. Your belief is true and you had a justification for it. But was it really knowledge? It seems more like a lucky guess that turned out to be correct. The Gettier-style problems reveal that mere justification and truth are not sufficient for knowledge. There must be something more, perhaps the absence of luck, stronger evidence, or a different way of justifying beliefs. The Gettier problem remains an open question in philosophy, leading to new theories about what separates real knowledge from mere coincidence. The categorical imperative is the central principle of Immanuel Kant's morality, which states that ethical actions must be universal and based on duty, rather than on consequences, unlike utilitarianism, which judges actions by their results. The contrary ethic maintains that morality consists of following absolute rules that apply to everyone, regardless of circumstances. Kant formulated the categorical imperative in different ways, but the most famous version is act only according to that maxim, whereby you can want at the same time that it becomes a universal law. In simpler terms, before performing any action, ask yourself, what would happen if everyone did that? If the action led to a contradictory or undesirable world, then it would be morally wrong. For example, suppose you're tempted to lie to get out of a bind. Applying the categorical imperative, you must ask yourself, what if everyone lied when it suited them? If lying became universal, trust would collapse and communication would cease to make sense, as a self-destructive world would be created. Lying is immoral. Another key formulation of the categorical imperative is treat humanity, both in yourself and in others, always as an end, never as a means. This means that people should never be used as tools for selfish purposes, exploiting others for personal gain, manipulating people, or treating them as disposable, which violates their dignity as rational beings. Kant's ethics emphasizes duty, respect, and moral coherence, while some criticize it for being too rigid, since it does not allow exceptions based on circumstances. It remains one of the most influential moral theories. The categorical imperative challenges us to act with integrity and to ensure that our moral principles can be applied to all people at all times. The mind-body problem is one of the oldest and most fundamental questions in philosophy. What is the relationship between the mind and the body? Are they separate substances? Is the mind just a function of the brain? How do thoughts, emotions, and consciousness arise from physical matter? This problem was most famously explored by René Descartes, who defended dualism, the idea that the mind and body are two distinct substances. According to Descartes, the body is physical and governed by the laws of nature, while the mind or soul is immaterial, capable of thinking and being aware of itself. The challenge of dualism is to explain how these two substances interact. If the mind is not physical, how does it influence the body? How does a thought like, I want to raise my hand, give rise to a physical movement? In contrast, monism argues that the mind and body are not separate. Materialism and physicalism, the dominant scientific view today, affirm that everything, including thoughts and emotions, can be explained by brain activity. According to this view, consciousness arises from the activation of neurons in complex patterns, and the mind is simply what the brain does. However, this leads to the difficult problem of consciousness. Why do certain brain processes give rise to subjective experience? A computer processes information, but feels nothing. Why does the human brain create the sensation of being alive? Other theories try to bridge this gap. Panpsychism suggests that consciousness is a fundamental property of a universe, present even in the smallest particles. Functionalism compares the mind to a software program that runs on the hardware of the brain, which means that, in theory, consciousness could exist in artificial intelligence. The mind-body problem remains unresolved. Whether consciousness is a byproduct of brain activity, a fundamental aspect of reality, or something beyond our understanding, it continues to challenge our understanding of what it means to be human. Achaia, weakness of will. Akrasia is the ancient Greek term for acting against one's own judgment, knowing what is right but not doing it. Is the internal struggle between reason and impulse. in which people make decisions that they themselves recognize as bad. Plato and Aristotle explored acrasia and wondered why rational beings sometimes do not follow reason. Suppose you decide to eat healthy, but late at night you binge on junk food. You knew it was a bad choice, but you did it anyway. This problem goes beyond diet, as it applies to procrastination, addiction, destructive relationships, and any situation in which people act against their own interests. Socrates believed that true knowledge prevents acrasia. If someone really understands that something is bad, they would not do it. He argued that ignorance, not weakness of will, is the cause of bad decisions. Aristotle disagreed and argued that people may know what is best, but still be carried away by emotions and desires. He saw acrasia as a failure of self-control rather than ignorance. Modern psychology supports Aristotle's view. Studies on cognitive bias, habit formation, and self-discipline show that willpower is limited and easily undermined by stress, temptation, or fatigue. The brain often prioritizes short-term pleasure over long-term well-being. Understanding acrasia is key to improving self-discipline strategies, such as habit creation, delayed gratification, and mindfulness, which can help overcome it. Whether in philosophy or in everyday life, acrasia remains a fundamental challenge. Knowing what is right is one thing, but doing it consistently is another. Dialectical materialism is the philosophical framework developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels to explain how history, society, and economic structures evolve through conflict and material conditions. It is based on two key ideas: dialectics, the process of change through contradictions, and materialism, the belief that material conditions, such as the economy, labor, and production, shape human society, rather than ideas or spiritual forces. In essence, dialectical materialism holds that history advances through class struggle. Marx saw society driven by contradictions between opposing economic classes, such as between the feudal lords and the peasants, or between the capitalists and the workers. These conflicts create tensions that ultimately lead to a revolutionary change in society. The contradiction lies in how wealth is produced by workers but controlled by owners. Marx predicted that this would lead to an inevitable struggle and the eventual rise of a classless communist society. Unlike traditional idealist philosophies, which see history as shaped by ideas, dialectical materialism insists that material forces that control the means of production, the distribution of goods, and the organization of labor determine societal development. In other words, the economy drives history forward. The dominant ideology of any era, be it religion, law, or morality, is not an independent force, but a reflection of the ruling class's interests. Dialectical materialism continues to influence political theory, economics, and sociology, although some argue that Marx underestimated human agency and cultural factors. Cultural factors. His framework continues to shape debates about inequality, labor rights, and the nature of historical progress. Whether you agree or disagree with Marxist thought, dialectical materialism offers a lens through which to analyze power, change, and economic structures in human history. The experience machine is a mental experiment proposed by the philosopher Robert Nozick to challenge hedonism, the idea that pleasure is the supreme good. It poses a simple but disturbing question: if you could connect to a machine that created perfectly pleasurable experiences, would you do it? Imagine a machine that could simulate any life you desired. You could experience fame, love, adventure, or happiness, all indistinguishable from real life. While you were connected, you would not know it was false. No suffering, no disappointments, just infinite joy. Since hedonism suggests that pleasure is the ultimate goal, wouldn't the rational choice be to remain connected forever? Nozick argues that most people would reject the machine, which demonstrates that. We value more than just pleasure. We want reality, even if imperfect. People care about being connected to truth, having genuine achievements, and living authentic lives, not just experiencing an illusion of happiness. This suggests that meaning, autonomy, and growth are more important than mere pleasure. The experience machine raises profound questions about human nature itself. It forces us to ask ourselves what makes a life worthwhile. If we could live in a simulated paradise, would it be less meaningful? This thought experiment remains highly relevant today, especially with advances in virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and debates about simulated worlds online. Nozick's conclusion challenges us to think beyond pleasure and consider what truly makes a life fulfilling. Utilitarianism is an ethical theory that states that the best action is the one that maximizes overall happiness and minimizes suffering. It is a form of consequentialism, meaning that actions are judged based on their results and not on intentions or inherent morality. The central idea is summarized in the principle of the greatest good for the greatest number of people. This philosophy was developed by Jeremy Bentham and later refined by John Stuart Mill. Bentham introduced the concept of hedonic calculus, a method for measuring pleasure and pain to determine the morality of an action. He argued that all pleasures and pains could be objectively weighted and that the action producing the most pleasure should be chosen. However, Mill recognized that not all pleasures are equal. Some, such as intellectual or moral pleasures, are superior and more valuable than basic physical pleasures. Utilitarianism is often praised for its practicality, as it provides a clear way to assess difficult moral dilemmas, such as medical ethics, e.g., distributing limited resources to save the most lives, or policymaking, e.g., drafting laws that benefit the majority. However, it also faces serious criticisms. One of the main problems is the tyranny of the majority. If maximizing happiness means harming a small group, does that justify the harm done? For example, if punishing an innocent person brought peace to a society, would that be moral? Another criticism is that utilitarianism ignores individual rights entirely. According to strict utilitarian logic, sacrificing one person to save five would be justified, but many consider this intuitively wrong. Despite these challenges, utilitarianism remains one of the most influential moral theories in philosophy, economics, and politics. It forces us to think about how our actions affect others and whether our moral choices truly maximize well-being. Zeno's paradoxes are a set of philosophical puzzles that challenge our understanding of movement, space, and infinity, proposed by the Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea. These paradoxes argue that movement and change, as we perceive them, may be illusions. One of the most famous is that of Achilles and the tortoise. Imagine a race in which Achilles, the faster runner, gives a head start to a slow tortoise. When Achilles reaches the tortoise's starting point, the tortoise has moved a bit further ahead. When Achilles reaches that new point, the tortoise has moved again slightly. This continues infinitely, which means that Achilles will never actually be able to reach the tortoise, but in reality, we know that he will. So where's the flaw in this reasoning? Another paradox is the paradox of dichotomy, which states that before reaching a destination, one must first reach halfway, and before reaching halfway, one must reach 1/4 of the way. Given that this sequence continues infinitely, it seems movement should be impossible, but we move all the time. Zenon used these paradoxes to support Pareto's idea that change and movement are illusions. However, modern mathematics and physics explain these enigmas using the concept of limits in calculus. Although there are infinite steps, these can add up to a finite distance, thus resolving the apparent contradiction. Even though mathematics has provided solutions, Zenon's paradoxes continue to spark debates about time, space, and infinity. They challenge our intuition and force us to question if reality is as simple as it seems. The anthropic principle is the idea that the universe seems to be adjusted for human life, because if it were not so, we would not be here to observe it. In other words, the mere fact that we exist imposes restrictions on the types of universes that can exist. This principle is presented in 2b here to observe it. In other words, the mere fact that we exist imposes restrictions on the types of universes that can exist. This principle is presented in two main forms. The weak anthropic principle, WAP, states that our observations of the universe are biased, because we can only exist in a universe that allows life if the fundamental physical constants, such as gravity, the speed of light, or the nuclear forces were even slightly different. Life, as we know it, would not be possible. The universe seems finely tuned, but that is only because we observe it from the only possible perspective, the one in which life exists. The strong anthropic principle SAP goes further and suggests that the universe must be structured in such a way that conscious life inevitably arises. Some interpretations even suggest that intelligence is a fundamental characteristic of the cosmos, or that there are multiple universes, each with different physical laws, and that we are simply in one that supports it. Critics argue that the anthropic principle is more a philosophical observation than a scientific explanation, since it does not tell us why the universe has these specific conditions, only that we could not observe any other. Some see it as a weak excuse to avoid deeper questions about the origins of the universe, while others consider it a key idea for cosmology, quantum mechanics, and the possible existence of a multiverse. In any case, it raises profound questions about whether the universe is uniquely structured for life or whether we are just a lucky accident among countless other possibilities. The liar's paradox is a self-referential statement that leads to a logical contradiction, most famously expressed as, "This statement is false." If the statement is true, then it must be false, since it claims to be false. But if it is false, then it must be true, because it correctly claims that it is false. The result is a loop without a clear resolution that reveals a profound problem in language and logic. Variations of the liar's paradox have puzzled philosophers for centuries. Consider a person who says, "Everything I say is false." If that statement is true, then everything he says, including that statement, is false, creating a contradiction. Similarly, if a sign says, "Ignore this sign," should you follow its instructions or ignore them? This paradox challenges the foundations of logic, language, and mathematics. It was an important topic for Bertrand Russell, who encountered similar contradictions while developing set theory. It also influenced Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which show that in any formal system of logic, there will always be statements that are true but impossible to prove. Possible solutions include rejecting self-referential statements as meaningless, creating new logical categories to handle paradoxes, or recognizing that truth is not always binary, true or false, but can exist on a spectrum. The liar's paradox remains an essential problem in philosophy, forcing us to rethink the limits of language, logic, and meaning itself. The problem of induction. The problem of induction is a fundamental challenge in epistemology, articulated clearly for the first time by David Hume. It questions whether we can justify our confidence in past experiences to predict the future. In simple terms, just because something has happened repeatedly in the past, does that mean it will continue to happen? Hume pointed out that much human reasoning is based on inductive inference, which draws general conclusions from specific observations. For example, we assume that the sun will rise tomorrow because it has risen every day before. But how do we really know? We have no absolute proof, only past experience. Hume argued that this reasoning is circular. We assume that the future will resemble the past because it always has, but that assumption itself is based on past experience, which is what we are trying to justify in the first place. This problem undermines the certainty of all empirical knowledge. Science, for example, relies heavily on induction, which consists of formulating general laws based on repeated experiments. But if induction itself has no logical basis, does that mean that all scientific conclusions are uncertain? Philosophers have proposed solutions such as pragmatism, which argues that induction works well in practice, so we should use it anyway, or probabilistic reasoning, which suggests that although induction is not logically certain, it is very likely to be reliable. However, the problem of induction remains unresolved, reminding us that much of what we know about the world is based not on certainty, but on custom and expectation. Falsificationism is a scientific philosophy proposed by Karl Popper as a response to the problem of induction. Instead of trying to prove the truth of theories through repeated observations, Power argued that scientific progress depends on our ability to prove theories false. According to falsificationism, a scientific theory only makes sense if it can be tested and potentially proven false. For example, if a theory states that all swans are white, observing thousands of white swans does not prove the theory, but finding a single black swan does. That is why Power rejected verificationism, the idea that science should focus on confirming theories, in favor of falsifiability as the true standard of science. Falsificationism separates science from pseudoscience. A good scientific theory makes bold predictions that, in principle, could be tested and refuted. In contrast, pseudosciences such as astrology or Freudian psychology often explain away counterexamples instead of accepting that their theories could be wrong. If a theory can accommodate any possible observation, it is not scientific because it is not falsifiable. However, falsificationism has its own challenges in real-world science. Theories are rarely discarded after a failed experiment. Scientists often revise or refine them. In addition, some fields such as quantum mechanics or cosmology deal with entities that cannot always be directly tested. Despite these issues, falsification remains a most important principle of the philosophy of science, determining how we distinguish real, scientific research from speculation and unfounded beliefs. The butterfly effect is the idea that small changes in initial conditions can lead to very different results in complex systems. It comes from chaos theory and was popularized by meteorologist Edward Lorenz, who discovered that small variations in atmospheric conditions could drastically alter weather predictions. The name comes from the poetic idea that a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil can, through a chain of small, unpredictable changes, cause a tornado in Texas. This principle challenges our intuitive belief that small causes produce small effects. In reality, many systems such as climate patterns, ecosystems, economies, and even human lives are very sensitive to small inputs. A minor decision, such as choosing one job over another, can trigger a sequence of events that alters your entire life. The butterfly effect also has philosophical implications, particularly with regard to free will. If the future is determined by countless small factors beyond our control, can we really predict or control our destiny? It also raises questions about responsibility. If small actions can have enormous consequences, how much control do we really have over the results? Although the butterfly effect emphasizes unpredictability, it does not mean that events are random, but highlights that even deterministic systems, in which results follow the laws of nature, can be so complex that they appear chaotic. This concept is widely used in physics, economics, psychology, and narrative, suggesting that even the smallest actions can have unimaginable significance. The Descartes paradox, also known as the heap paradox, challenges our understanding of vague concepts and gradual change. It asks how many grains of sand make a heap. Imagine that you have a heap of sand. If you remove a grain, it is still a heap. If you remove another, it is still a heap. But if you continue this process to reach a point where you have only a few grains left, when did it stop being a heap? Conversely, if you start with one grain and add more, at what exact point does it become a heap? This paradox highlights the problem of the vagueness of language. Many concepts, such as baldness, wealth, or height, have no clear boundaries. If a person loses hair gradually, when is he considered bald? If you save a little money each time, when do you consider yourself rich? These concepts are based on arbitrary thresholds rather than precise definitions. Philosophers have proposed several solutions. Fuzzy logic suggests that truth is not binary, true or false, but exists on a spectrum. Others argue that, although the boundaries are not clear, we can still use approximate reasoning in everyday life. Some completely reject the paradox, claiming that language is imprecise by nature and that trying to impose absolute definitions on vague concepts is a mistake. The Descartes paradox is more than a linguistic puzzle. It has implications in the real world. It applies to law. When does a minor crime become serious? To ethics. When does a lie become unacceptable? And to identity. How much can a person change and still be the same? The paradox forces us to confront the limits of human reasoning and challenges us to think more carefully about how we define the world around us. The lottery paradox is a philosophical puzzle that exposes the contradictions in how we justify our beliefs, especially in situations involving probability. It was introduced by Henry Kaiberg and challenges our understanding of rational belief and certainty. Consider a fair lottery with 10,000 tickets and only one winning ticket. It is rational to believe that any ticket will lose because the probability of losing is extremely high, 9,999 out of 10,000. If this reasoning is applied to all tickets, then we must also believe that all tickets will lose. However, this contradicts the fact that one ticket must win. How can we rationally believe that all tickets will lose, knowing that one of them must win? This paradox highlights the tension between rationality and probability. Intuitively, we think that if something is very unlikely, we are justified in believing that it will not happen. But when this logic is applied universally, it leads to a contradiction and raises key questions in epistemology. Should rational belief be based purely on probability? Can we be justified in believing something that is not true? One proposed solution is to redefine what it means to believe something. In probabilistic terms, some argue that belief should be seen as degrees of confidence rather than absolute truths, which means that we should not fully believe that a single ticket is going to lose, but only that it is extremely likely to do so. The lottery paradox remains an important problem in debates about logic, probability, and the nature of rational belief. Bourron's ass is a paradox about free will, decision-making, and rationality, named after the 14th century philosopher Jean Buridan. It illustrates a situation in which pure rationality leads to inaction. Imagine a donkey standing exactly between two identical piles of hay. The donkey, being perfectly rational, has no reason to prefer one pile to the other, since both options are equally desirable. He cannot make a rational decision and, as a result, starves to death, unable to choose one. This paradox highlights a problem when determining rational decision-making. If all choices are based solely on reason and external factors, then, in cases where all factors are equal, making decisions becomes impossible. This raises the question of whether rationality is enough to make decisions or whether we need some form of spontaneity, randomness, or free will. The Buridan's donkey argument is relevant in philosophy, psychology, and artificial intelligence. It applies to human decision-making when people find themselves between two equal options, like choosing between two equally attractive job offers. It also raises concerns for AI. If an algorithm is purely rational, how could it resolve a conflict between two equal options? One possible solution is to break the tie with an arbitrary choice, suggesting that randomness, intuition, or external influences play a necessary role in decision-making. Although the paradox is a playful thought experiment, it has profound implications for free will, determinism, and the limits of logical reasoning in real-world decisions. Metaphysics is the branch of philosophy that examines the nature, origin, and meaning of moral concepts. Unlike normative ethics, which asks what actions are right or wrong, metaphysics explores what morality itself is. It raises fundamental questions, such as, are moral values objective or subjective? Do moral claims express facts or simply opinions? Can we really know what is right from wrong? One of the main debates in metaphysics is between moral realism and moral anti-realism. Moral realists argue that moral truths exist independently of human beliefs, just as mathematical truths do. For example, murder is objectively wrong, regardless of personal or cultural opinions. In contrast, moral anti-realists claim that morality is constructed by human beings and has no objective existence outside our perceptions. According to this point of view, moral norms are more like social agreements than universal truths. Another key debate lies between cognitivism and non-cognitivism. Cognitivists believe that moral claims, for example, stealing is wrong, express factual claims that could be true or false. Non-cognitivists, however, argue that moral claims are expressions of emotions or commands. When someone says stealing is wrong, They are not stating a fact, but expressing disapproval or discouraging theft. Metaethics also examines how we justify moral beliefs, basing our moral values on reason, emotions, or social conventions. Some philosophers argue that morality is based on rational principles, while others believe that it arises from evolutionary or psychological factors. The study of metaethics is crucial because it influences how we approach ethical dilemmas. If morality is objective, moral debates may have definitive answers. But if morality is subjective, ethical disagreements may never be fully resolved. By questioning the foundations of moral reasoning, metaethics forces us to think deeply about what it truly means to be good or bad. The argument from illusion is a philosophical problem that questions the reliability of our senses by pointing out that perception is not always accurate. It suggests that if we sometimes experience illusions or hallucinations, how can we be sure that our senses are telling us the truth? For example, when a stick is half submerged in water, it appears bent, even though it is actually straight. A distant object may appear smaller than it is, and a mirage may make us see water where there is none. If our senses deceive us in these cases, how do we know that they do not deceive us all the time? This leads to a deeper question. Do we perceive reality as it is, or do we only experience distorted representations of it? This argument has been used by skeptics to question the possibility of absolute knowledge. René Descartes used a similar argument in his Meditations, suggesting that if our senses can deceive us, we should doubt all knowledge based on them. He extended this skepticism with the idea of an evil demon, a hypothetical being that could be deceiving us into believing a completely false reality. In response, indirect realists argue that we do not perceive the external world directly, but through mental representations. Idealists, like George Berkeley, go even further and claim that reality itself is nothing more than perceptions in the mind. The argument from illusion remains relevant in modern philosophy and cognitive science, as it links to debates about virtual reality, simulation, and the nature of consciousness. It raises the disturbing possibility that what we consider reality may be just an elaborate illusion shaped by the limitations of our perception. The open question argument, proposed by G. E. Moore in his 1903 book Principia Ethica, is a powerful critique of ethical naturalism, the idea that moral properties, such as good or bad, can be defined in terms of natural properties, such as pleasure, survival, or evolutionary benefit. Moore argued that moral concepts cannot be reduced to empirical or scientific facts, because moral questions are always open to further questioning. His reasoning is simple. Suppose someone claims that good equates to pleasure. Then we can ask ourselves, is pleasure truly good? If this question makes sense, then good and pleasure cannot be identical, because if two terms are truly synonymous, questioning their equivalence would not make sense. For example, asking if a bachelor is an unmarried man seems trivial because the definitions are identical, but asking if pleasure is good is still a legitimate and open question, meaning that good cannot be simply defined as pleasure. This argument, now known as Moore's paradox, suggests that moral terms refer to something beyond physical or psychological facts. Many believe that goodness is a simple, indefinable property, something that we recognize intuitively, but cannot reduce to scientific explanations. The open question argument has had a lasting impact on ethics, moving philosophers away from defining morality in purely naturalistic or scientific terms. It challenges any attempt to equate moral values with biology, psychology, or economics and suggests that morality operates in a distinct, irreducible realm. However, critics argue that language evolves and that the fact that a question seems open does not mean it lacks an objective answer. The debate about whether morality is independent of natural facts continues to shape modern philosophy. The death of the author is a radical literary theory introduced by Roland Barthes in his 1967 essay of the same name. It challenges the idea that the author's intentions, biography, or personal meaning are key to understanding a text. Instead, Barthes argues that Once the work is created, the author's influence on its interpretation disappears, leaving the meaning entirely in the hands of the reader. Traditionally, literary criticism sought to unravel the meaning that the author wanted to transmit by analyzing their life, historical context, or psychological state. Barthes rejected this approach, arguing that focusing on the author's intention limits the richness of interpretation. Instead, he argued that texts do not have a unique, fixed meaning, but that meaning arises through the interaction between the reader and the words on the page. From this point of view, literature is not about discovering what the author meant, but about exploring what the text does for a reader. Barthes' theory has profound implications for literature, art, and even philosophy. It suggests that works are independent entities open to infinite interpretations, and that trying to find a single authoritative meaning is misguided. This idea influenced postmodernism, deconstruction, and reader response theory, all of which emphasize the subjective experience of meaning rather than the creator's original intention. However, the death of the author is controversial. Critics argue that completely dismissing the author ignores the historical and cultural context that shapes a work. Some also point out that many authors deliberately encode specific meanings in their texts. While Barthes' idea is extreme, it raises an important question. Should we judge a work by what the author intended or by what it means to us? Regardless of whether one agrees with Barthes or not, his argument remains one of the most influential challenges to traditional literary interpretation, which has redefined our way of thinking about meaning, authorship, and the reader's role in understanding texts. The identity of indiscernibles is a principle of metaphysics proposed by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, which states that if two entities share all their properties, then they must be the same entity. In other words, if there is no way to distinguish between two objects, not even in theory, then they are not really separate but are one and the same. Leibniz formulated this principle as a response to philosophical debates about identity and difference. If two things are truly distinct, there must be at least one characteristic that differentiates them. If there is no such difference, then they are identical. This principle is sometimes summarized as, there are no two things that can be exactly the same in all respects and still be distinct. This idea has profound implications in logic, metaphysics, and even physics. In classical philosophy, it suggests that individuality is based on unique properties and not on mere existence. However, in quantum mechanics, this principle is challenged by particles such as electrons, which appear to be completely identical and indistinguishable. Some interpretations suggest that, at a fundamental level, identity may not work as we intuitively think. A related concept is Leibniz's law, which states that if two things are identical, then everything that is true for one must be true for the other. This forms the basis of many logical and philosophical arguments about identity, especially in debates about personal identity, time, and the nature of objects. The identity of indiscernibles forces us to ask what really makes something unique. Is identity based on intrinsic properties, or do we impose distinctions through perception and language? These questions remain fundamental in contemporary philosophy, especially in debates about the nature of reality and individuality. The hard problem of consciousness is a term coined by philosopher David Chalmers to describe the deepest and most perplexing question in the philosophy of mind. Why and how does the physical activity of the brain give rise to subjective experience? While neuroscience has made great strides in understanding the mechanisms of the brain, how neurons are activated, how perception works, and how memories are stored, often called the easy problems of consciousness, the hard problem goes beyond function and asks why we experience things, why seeing the color red feels like something, why pain hurts instead of simply being a neutral signal processed in the brain. This question is especially problematic for materialism, the idea that everything, including the mind, is purely physical. If the brain is just a biological machine, why does it generate an internal subjective reality? Could a sufficiently advanced robot, built with circuits instead of neurons, experience consciousness as humans do? Or would it simply behave as if it were conscious without actually feeling anything? Some theories try to explain consciousness through emergent properties, suggesting that when a system reaches a certain level of complexity, consciousness arises naturally. Others, such as panpsychism, argue that consciousness is a fundamental characteristic of the universe, present even in the smallest particles. Despite decades of research, the hard problem of consciousness remains unresolved. It raises profound questions about free will, artificial intelligence, and the very nature of reality. If we cannot explain why we experience the world the way we do, we may still be far from understanding what it really means to be human. The Gaia hypothesis is the idea that the Earth and its biological systems function as a single self-regulating organism that maintains conditions favorable for life. Proposed by James Lovelock in the 1970s, the hypothesis suggests that life itself plays an active role in stabilizing the environment, such as regulating temperature, atmospheric composition, and ocean salinity, ensuring that the Earth remains habitable for long periods. Lovelock's theory challenges the traditional view that life simply adapts to the environment. Instead, it argues that life actively shapes its environment. For example, the Earth's atmosphere contains a much higher concentration of oxygen than would be expected from geological processes alone. This is due to photosynthetic organisms, which continuously produce oxygen, maintaining a stable balance that sustains life. Similarly, the salinity of the oceans has remained within narrow limits for hundreds of millions of years, even though natural erosion should have made the oceans too salty for life. Lovelock suggests that biological processes help regulate these levels. Although the Gaia hypothesis is sometimes misinterpreted as implying that the Earth is conscious or alive, Lovelock clarified that these are not mystical beliefs, but complex systems with feedback loops. However, the hypothesis has been controversial. Critics argue that evolution operates on individual organisms, not entire planets, and that life does not deliberately regulate the environment. Even so, some aspects of Gaia theory have been incorporated into modern Earth system science, climate studies, and debates about how human activity alters the natural balance. The Gaia hypothesis forces us to rethink our relationship with the planet, not as passive inhabitants, but as part of an interconnected system in which life and environment continually shape each other. Whether fully accepted or not, it has influenced debates about climate change, sustainability, and the fragile balance that allows Earth to remain a habitable world. The free rider problem is a classic issue in economics, ethics, and political philosophy that occurs when individuals benefit from a shared resource or service without contributing to its maintenance or cost. It highlights the challenge of collective action. How can we ensure that everyone contributes to public goods when people have an incentive to let others bear the burden? A common example is public transportation. If a city funds buses with taxes instead of fares, some may avoid paying taxes but still use the buses. Similarly, in a team project at work, some members may put in less effort knowing that others will complete the work. In national defense, all citizens benefit from security regardless of whether they actively support or fund the military. The key issue is that when too many people try to take advantage of the system, it collapses. If no one pays for public transportation, it cannot function. The free rider problem is closely related to the tragedy of the commons, in which individuals overuse a shared resource, such as overfishing in the ocean, because they assume that others will manage it responsibly. It is also related to the prisoner's dilemma game, in which individuals acting in their own interest can lead to worse outcomes for everyone. Solutions to the free rider problem include tax laws and incentives. Governments impose taxes to fund public goods, while organizations use rewards or penalties to encourage participation. Some societies rely on social norms, such as peer pressure or moral responsibility, to ensure cooperation. The free rider problem remains an important challenge in issues such as climate change. Why should a country reduce its emissions if others do not? And in the field of voting, why should I vote if my vote does not decide the election? Understanding this problem helps explain why collective action is difficult and why human cooperation often requires something more than rational self-interest. The simulation hypothesis proposes that reality, as we know, it could be a very advanced computer simulation instead of a fundamental physical reality. The philosopher Nick Bostrom popularized this idea by arguing that if technological civilizations advanced enough, they could create realistic simulated worlds that included conscious beings who would not know they are part of the simulation. Bostrom's argument is based on probability. It suggests that at least one of the three possibilities must be true. Either civilizations never reach the stage of creating advanced simulations due to self-destruction or technological limitations, or civilizations reach that stage, but decide not to run simulations, or we are almost certainly living in a simulation. If a civilization were capable of creating realistic simulated beings, it would probably create many such simulations, possibly billions. If this were the case, the number of simulated beings would far exceed that of real ones, which means that, statistically, it is more likely that we are simulated than real. The simulation hypothesis raises profound questions about free will, consciousness, and the nature of reality. If we are in a simulation, the question arises of whether we could ever escape. Would the simulator be a divine entity? Could entire universes be simulated within other simulations, creating an infinite chain of realities? Critics argue that the hypothesis is unfalsifiable, which means that it cannot be proven or disproven, making it scientifically meaningless. Others suggest that even if we were simulated, there would be no practical difference, since the simulation would still follow consistent rules that we perceive as physics, regardless of its validity. The simulation hypothesis forces us to rethink our fundamental understanding of existence. If we were in a simulation, how would we know? And if we discovered the truth, would anything change? Skepticism is the philosophical position that doubts the certainty of knowledge and questions whether we can truly know anything with absolute confidence. It challenges assumptions about reality, perception, and belief, and pushes us to reconsider how we acquire knowledge and whether we can trust our perceptions. One of the first skeptics, Pio d'Alizio, argued that human beings should suspend judgment on all matters, since certainty is unattainable. Later, René Descartes introduced radical skepticism, which doubted even the existence of the outside world. He proposed the thought experiment of an evil demon who deceived us into believing in a false reality. His only unbreakable truth was cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, since even doubt itself demonstrated the existence of a conscious thinker. Skepticism manifests itself in multiple ways. Empirical skepticism questions whether our senses provide reliable information, given that illusions and hallucinations can deceive us. Moral skepticism challenges the notion of objective moral truths, suggesting that morality may be a human construct rather than an absolute norm. Religious skepticism critically examines claims about God, miracles, and supernatural events, often demanding empirical evidence before accepting such beliefs. Skepticism plays a vital role in science, philosophy, and everyday reasoning, encouraging the demand for evidence, logical consistency, and critical thinking. However, extreme skepticism can lead to solipsism, the belief that only one's own mind is certain, making meaningful engagement with reality difficult. Philosophers like David Hume advocated for moderate skepticism, arguing that while certainty is impossible, we can still form rational beliefs based on probability and experience. This balance between doubt and pragmatism allows us to question assumptions while still engaging with reality. Skepticism remains fundamental in modern debates about misinformation, scientific theories, and conspiracy beliefs, reminding us that questioning is valuable, but also that, at some point, we must act based on reasonable evidence, even if absolute certainty remains unattainable. Eternalism versus presentism. The debate between eternalism and presentism refers to the nature of time and existence. Eternalism holds that all moments past, present, and future exist equally, while presentism argues that only the present moment is real, since the past has disappeared and the future does not yet exist. Eternism is often compared to a block universe, where time is like a fourth dimension similar to space, Just as different places exist simultaneously, all points in time exist at once, though we only experience one at a time. This vision aligns with Einstein's theory of relativity, which suggests that time is not absolute, but relative to the observer. If all moments exist, then concepts like destiny and determinism become important, since the future is already there, in a sense. Presentism, on the other hand, argues that only the present moment is real. The past no longer exists, and the future is yet to be determined. This fits more with common sense. Events fade into memory, and the future remains unknown. Critics argue that presentism struggles to explain the flow of time in a scientifically rigorous way. This debate remains unresolved, raising fundamental questions about free will, destiny, and whether time is something we move through or an illusion of perception. The ontological argument is a philosophical argument in favor of the existence of God based on logic and reason, rather than empirical evidence. First formulated by Anselm of Canterbury, it affirms that the very concept of God implies his necessary existence. Anselm defined God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. If God exists only as an idea in the mind but not in reality, then a greater being can be conceived, one that exists both in thought and reality. Since God is defined as the greatest possible being, he must exist both in reality and thought. Otherwise, he would not truly be the greatest. This argument was later refined by philosophers such as René Descartes and Gottfried Leibniz. Descartes affirmed that, just as the concept of a triangle necessarily includes three sides, the concept of God necessarily includes existence. Leibniz tried to reinforce the argument by clarifying that God's existence must be logically possible, which makes it necessary. Critics, such as Immanuel Kant, rejected the argument, claiming that existence is not a property that can be attributed like omniscience or perfection. Just because we can define something in a certain way does not mean that it exists. Bertrand Russell and other philosophers have also argued that the ontological argument relies too much on wordplay rather than real-world evidence. Despite its controversies, the argument remains one of the most debated proofs for the existence of God, forcing philosophers to consider whether logic alone can establish reality. The mereological paradox arises from the philosophical study of mereology, which examines how parts are related to wholes. It asks whether objects are truly distinct from their components or whether they are simply a collection of parts. This paradox challenges our basic assumptions about identity, composition, and what it means for something to exist as a whole, rather than as the sum of its parts. A famous mereological puzzle is the ship of Theseus. If all the parts of ship are gradually replaced, is it still the same ship if the old parts are reassembled into another ship? Which is the real ship of Theseus? Mereology forces us to ask ourselves if objects retain their identity through change or if they become entirely new entities. Another question is mereological nihilism, the radical view that composite objects do not exist. Only the smallest indivisible parts exist. According to this view, things like tables and people are just convenient labels for collections of particles rather than real entities. The mereological paradox highlights profound problems in ontology and identity. If objects are only their parts, what makes a whole more than just a collection? And if objects are more than their parts, what defines their unity? These questions remain fundamental to modern metaphysics. Quietism is a philosophical stance suggesting that many philosophical problems arise from misunderstandings of language or thought, and that the best response is to stop engaging in such debates. Instead of seeking definitive answers, Quietism encourages a detached, passive approach to philosophical inquiry, arguing that many disputes are meaningless or irresolvable. Ludwig Wittgenstein, a famous quietist, believed that philosophical problems often stem from the misuse of language. In his later work, he argued that, instead of trying to resolve profound metaphysical or epistemological questions, we should recognize that these arise from confusion about how language works. For example, debates about whether free will or the self exists could be dissolved if we simply recognize that different contexts give these terms different meanings. Quietism also appears in ethical and religious traditions, such as Taoism and certain Buddhist schools, where emphasis is placed on inner peace, detachment, and avoiding unnecessary intellectual struggle, rather than seeking ultimate truths. Quietists accept the limits of human knowledge and focus on how we live and communicate. Critics argue that quietism is excessively passive, as it avoids resolving important issues. However, its defenders claim that many philosophical problems only seem profound because they are formulated in a misleading way. Whether a path to wisdom or an escape from difficult questions, quietism remains an influential response to the great enigmas of philosophy. The paradox of choice is the idea that, although having choices is generally considered a good thing, having too many choices can lead to anxiety, indecision, and dissatisfaction. Psychologist Barry Schwartz popularized this concept by arguing that the overabundance of options can actually make people less happy than more free. In a world with unlimited options, whether in career, relationships, consumer goods, or life decisions, people often feel overwhelmed rather than liberated, experience paralysis in decision-making in which they find it very difficult to choose. And even when they do, they may suffer remorse or fear of missing out, worrying about having made the wrong decision or having been able to choose something better. Schwartz distinguishes between two types of decision-makers: maximizers and satisficers. Maximizers try to find the absolute best option, comparing all the possibilities and often feeling dissatisfied. Satisficers, on the other hand, settle for good enough and tend to be happier. This suggests that learning to accept good enough may be psychologically healthier than always striving for the perfect choice. The paradox of choice has implications for economics, mental health, and everyday decision-making. It raises an important question. Is more freedom always better freedom? Is freedom always better? Or does simplicity lead to greater happiness? Sometimes, fewer options can mean a more fulfilling life. The principle of Cernic, the principle of Capern, is the idea that human beings do not occupy a privileged or special position in the universe. It is named after Nicholas Copernicus, who demonstrated that the Earth orbits the Sun instead of being the center of the cosmos. This principle suggests that our place in the universe is likely nothing special. Historically, people believed that the Earth was at the center of everything. The Copernican model broke this assumption by demonstrating that the Earth is just one planet among many. This idea has extended to modern cosmology, implying that our solar system, our galaxy, and even our observable universe are not unique or special, but part of a vast, indifferent cosmos. The Copernican principle has profound implications in astronomy, since it suggests that if life arose on Earth, it is likely to exist elsewhere. In philosophy, it questions human exceptionalism and raises questions about our importance. It also supports the principle of mediocrity, which states that the Earth and humanity are probably normal and not unique. However, the Copernican principle also has its limits. Some argue that the Earth seems unusual in its ability to sustain complex life, suggesting that our position might not be entirely random. Even so, this principle continues to shape scientific thought and reminds us that the universe is vast and that perhaps we are not as important in it as we once thought. Socratic irony is a rhetorical technique used by Socrates in which he pretends to be ignorant or humble to highlight contradictions in another person's beliefs. It is a form of feigned ignorance that forces the opponent to critically examine their own beliefs, which often leads them to realize that they do not understand what they thought they knew. Socrates engaged in dialogue by asking seemingly innocent questions and pretending not to know the answer. His opponents, believing themselves wise, confidently explained their points of view, but by continuing to ask questions, Socrates revealed flaws in their reasoning. The person ended up reaching a point where they had no choice but to admit their ignorance, hence Socrates' famous statement, "I only know that I know nothing." Nothing. This technique is fundamental in the Socratic method, a teaching style that encourages critical thinking through persistent questions and that remains the basis of philosophical research, law, and education. Socratic irony can be considered both a teaching tool and a subtle form of intellectual trap, since, although it encourages self-reflection, it can also frustrate opponents, making them feel humiliated instead of enlightened. Despite this, it remains one of the most powerful methods for revealing the limits of knowledge. The naturalistic fallacy. The naturalistic fallacy is a logical error in ethical reasoning in which people assume that what is natural is automatically good or correct. The term was introduced by G. E. Moore in his book Principia Ethica, where he argued that moral values cannot be defined based solely on natural properties such as pleasure, survival, or evolutionary success. This fallacy is often expressed in arguments such as, since human beings evolved to eat meat, eating meat is morally correct, or, since aggression exists in nature, it must be acceptable. However, the fact that something occurs naturally does not mean that it is ethically justified. Diseases, suffering, and violence are also natural, but we do not consider them good. The fallacy highlights a key distinction between descriptive claims, what is, and prescriptive claims, what should be. The fact that something occurs in nature does not mean that it should occur in society. Ethics requires additional reasoning beyond what is simply natural. This fallacy remains relevant in debates about morality, politics, and science, reminding us that nature is not necessarily a moral guide, and that ethical principles must be evaluated on their own merits, not just on what seems natural. The evil demon hypothesis. The evil demon hypothesis is a thought experiment of radical skepticism introduced by René Descartes to question the reliability of human perception and knowledge. Descartes proposed the idea that a powerful and malevolent being, an evil demon, could be deceiving us and making us believe in a false reality. In this scenario, everything we perceive, our senses, our memories, even our logical reasoning, could be manipulated by this entity. If such a demon existed, how could we be sure that anything we believe is true? This hypothesis serves as the basis for Descartes' method, in which he systematically doubts everything in search of absolute certainty. The only thing that survives this extreme skepticism is cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Even if the demon is deceiving Descartes, there must still be a thinking being who is being deceived. This finding provides the first unshakable foundation of knowledge. The evil demon hypothesis continues to influence debates about skepticism, consciousness, and artificial reality. It has inspired modern variations, such as the brain in a vat thought experiment and the simulation hypothesis, which challenge our ability to verify reality beyond our subjective experience. Hume's guillotine, also known as the Azote problem, is a principle introduced by David Hume that argues that moral or prescriptive claims about what should be done cannot be logically derived from purely factual or descriptive claims about what is. This challenges the idea that ethical truths can be based directly on natural facts. Hume observed that many philosophers move from claims about how the world is to conclusions about how the world should be without providing a logical justification. For example, someone might argue that people have always engaged in wars, so war is natural and should not be avoided. Hume points out that this reasoning is flawed because there is a logical gap between describing what happens and prescribing what should happen. This principle has had a profound impact on ethics and moral philosophy, as it suggests that moral values cannot be deduced directly from nature or science alone, but that there must be an ethical framework or additional reasoning. Hume's guillotine forces us to critically examine moral claims and consider whether they are based on sound reasoning or are simply assumed from observations. Modern debates in ethics, law, and political philosophy continue to grapple with this issue. It serves as a warning against formulating moral arguments based solely on tradition, biology, or social norms, reminding us that morality requires more than appealing to what already exists. The no true Scotsman fallacy. The no true Scotsman fallacy is a logical fallacy in which someone redefines a category ad hoc to exclude the counterexamples that refute their claim. It is a form of circular reasoning often used to protect a belief from criticism, changing the definition instead of addressing the argument. The term comes from an example in which someone claims that no Scotsman puts sugar in their porridge when presented with a counterexample. My friend Angus is Scottish and puts sugar in his porridge. The person responds, well, no true Scotsman does that. Instead of admitting that their claim was incorrect, they redefine Scotsman to exclude the counterexample. This fallacy is common in ideological debates. Someone might say that no true gamer plays mobile games, or that no true patriot criticizes their country when presented with evidence. Instead of reevaluating their claim, they modify the definition to exclude the example. The no true Scotsman fallacy highlights the problem of manipulating definitions. Instead of facing contrary evidence, it dismisses it outright. Recognizing this fallacy helps identify intellectually dishonest arguments in which the rules of the game are changed to avoid admitting mistakes. Moore's paradox, introduced by G. E. Moore, describes a contradiction that arises when someone makes a statement like, "It is raining, but I do not believe it is raining." This sentence is not logically contradictory, since it is possible that it is raining while I do not believe it is raining. This sentence is not logically contradictory, since it is possible that it is raining even if someone does not believe it, but it is epistemologically absurd because believing it requires maintaining two contradictory attitudes at once. This paradox raises fundamental questions about belief, self-awareness, and rationality. Normally, if we affirm something, we also believe it is true. If someone says, "I am in pain, but I do not believe I am in pain," we recognize that something has gone wrong, not in the logic but in the coherence of their belief system. Moore's paradox has been explored in the philosophy of mind, language, and self-knowledge. It forces us to ask what it means to believe something. If believing implies an internal commitment to truth, then making contradictory claims about belief seems irrational. This paradox also appears in psychology and cognitive science, where people sometimes have contradictory thoughts due to cognitive dissonance. It helps us understand why self-awareness and belief are closely related, making it one of the most intriguing enigmas in the philosophy of language and thought. The paradox of tolerance, introduced by Karl Popper, states that if a society is tolerant without limits, it will end up being destroyed by the intolerant. In other words, unlimited tolerance can lead to the end of tolerance itself. Popper argued that, while societies should be open and accept different points of view, they should not tolerate intolerance to the point of allowing oppressive ideologies to take control. If intolerant groups are given free rein to spread hatred, violence, or anti-democratic values, they will end up dismantling the very freedoms that allowed them to exist. Therefore, to preserve a tolerant society, it may be necessary to deny tolerance to the intolerant when they threaten the rights and safety of others. This paradox raises difficult questions about freedom of expression, democracy, and the limits of tolerance. Should societies allow hate speech or extremist ideologies in the name of freedom of expression, even if they aim to destroy that same freedom? Where do we draw the line between protecting diversity of thought and preventing harmful movements from taking root? The paradox of tolerance remains relevant in modern debates about censorship, hate speech laws, and the rise of authoritarianism. It reminds us that absolute tolerance can be counterproductive and that some level of restriction may be necessary to preserve an open society. Russell's paradox. Russell, discovered by Bertrand Russell in 1901, is a fundamental problem in set theory that highlights the contradictions in the way we define collections. Specifically, it questions the idea that a set can contain itself as a member. Russell asked, does the set of all sets that do not contain themselves contain itself? If it contains itself, then by definition, it should not contain itself, but if it does not contain itself, then it must belong to the set, which means that it does contain itself. This contradiction reveals a profound flaw in early mathematical logic. To understand the paradox, let us imagine a barber in a city who shaves everyone who does not shave themselves. The question arises, does the barber shave himself? If he does, he should not, because he only shaves those who do not shave themselves. But if he does not, then he must, because he shaves everyone who does not shave themselves. This self-referential loop reflects Russell's paradox in set theory. This paradox led to the development of modern logic and mathematical foundations, including Zermelo, Frankel's set theory, which avoids self-referential sets. It also has broader implications for logic, philosophy, and computer science, influencing areas such as Gödel's incompleteness theorems and debates about self-reference in artificial intelligence. Russell's paradox remains one of the most famous paradoxes in mathematics and philosophy, as it illustrates the dangers of self-reference and the need to carefully define logical systems. The paradox of omnipotence questions whether an all-powerful being can create a task that it is not able to complete. The most famous version asks, can an omnipotent being create a rock so heavy that it cannot lift it? If the being can create such a rock, then there is something it cannot do. Lift it, which means it is not truly omnipotent. But if it cannot create such a rock, then there is something it cannot do, which challenges the concept of unlimited power. This paradox raises profound questions about the nature of omnipotence, logic, and the limits of power. Some theologians and philosophers, such as Thomas Aquinas, argue that omnipotence should be understood as the ability to do all things that are logically possible, meaning that contradictions, such as creating a square circle, are not included in the definition of omnipotence. Others, such as C.S. Lewis, suggest God's power does not extend to contradictions, as they are not real things but meaningless statements. The paradox of omnipotence remains a central challenge in theology and philosophy of religion, especially in debates about whether an all-powerful being can exist without logical contradictions. This forces us to reconsider whether omnipotence means the power to do anything or only what is logically possible. The prisoner's dilemma is a fundamental problem in game theory and decision-making that demonstrates how rational individuals can act against their own interests when they cannot trust one another. It is typically posed as a scenario in which two criminals are arrested and placed into separate interrogation rooms. Each one receives the same offer. If one betrays the other while the other remains silent, the traitor goes free, while the silent prisoner receives the maximum penalty. If both betray each other, both receive a moderate penalty. If both remain silent, each receives a minimum penalty. From a purely rational perspective, each prisoner should betray the other, since betrayal offers the best individual outcome, regardless of what the other does. However, if both betray each other, they end up worse than if they had cooperated and remained silent. This dilemma shows how individual rationality can lead to collective failure. The prisoner's dilemma has implications in economics, politics, and psychology, especially in matters of trust, cooperation, and competition. It explains why companies engage in destructive price wars, why nations struggle to disarm, and why individuals sometimes act selfishly even when cooperation would benefit everyone. The dilemma highlights the difficulty of achieving mutual trust in uncertain situations. It also suggests that cooperation can arise when people expect to interact repeatedly, as long-term trust changes the incentives to work together rather than act selfishly. The lottery fallacy occurs when people assume that, because an event is highly improbable, it cannot or should not occur. This fallacy often arises in discussions about probability, luck, and rare events, leading to erroneous reasoning about randomness and chance. A classic example is when someone wins the lottery and skeptics claim that the event must have been rigged because the odds were astronomically low. However, this reasoning is flawed, since, while the probability of a specific person winning is extremely small, the probability of someone winning is quite high given the large number of participants. The fallacy occurs when people misinterpret improbable events as impossible or when they assume that an unlikely event must have some extraordinary explanation. This fallacy is commonly found in conspiracy theories, where people reject coincidences or unlikely events as too improbable to be natural. It also appears in arguments about evolution, where critics may claim that complex life is too unlikely to have arisen randomly, ignoring the vast timescales and number of possible mutations involved. Understanding the lottery fallacy helps distinguish between genuine improbability and statistical inevitability. While rare events are individually unlikely in a large enough system, even the most unlikely events become expected over time. The problem of criterion. The problem of the criterion, introduced by the philosopher Roderick Chisholm, is a fundamental dilemma in epistemology that questions how we can distinguish true knowledge from falsehood. It poses a circular problem for determining whether a belief is justified. We need a reliable method to evaluate knowledge. But to establish that our method is reliable, we must first identify which beliefs are true. This creates a paradox. How can we define knowledge without already knowing what knowledge is? This problem appears in everyday reasoning. If someone asks, "How do you know that this statement is true?" the answer could be, "By this reliable method." But if they then ask, "How do you know that that method is reliable?" we must resort to another justification that in turn needs validation. In the end, the argument risks falling into an infinite regression that requires new justifications or in a circular reasoning that takes for granted what we are trying to demonstrate. There are two main responses to this problem. Methodists argue that we must start by establishing a clear method for determining the truth before deciding what we can know. Particularists, on the other hand, argue that we already know some things and that we should build our criteria of knowledge based on those examples. The problem of the criterion remains one of the most profound challenges in philosophy, as it forces us to examine whether certainty is possible and whether our attempts to justify knowledge are doomed to circularity or infinite skepticism. Hume's problem of miracles is a skeptical argument that questions whether we can ever be justified in believing that a miracle has occurred. In his book, An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, David Hume defines a miracle as a violation of the laws of nature, something that contradicts our usual experience of how the world works. His argument suggests that believing in miracles requires an unreasonable level of evidence. Hume's reasoning is based on probability, since natural laws are confirmed by countless observations. Fire burns, people do not resurrect, and objects fall when dropped. Reports of miracles are much more likely to be confusions than that natural laws have actually been violated. Given the choice between accepting a highly improbable event or assuming a mistake, a deception, or an exaggeration, the rational conclusion is often skepticism. He also points out that reports of miracles often come from unreliable sources, such as religious fanatics or ancient texts. Human psychology is prone to bias, delusional thinking, and exaggeration, making miraculous claims even more suspicious. Hume's problem of miracles remains fundamental in debates about religion, epistemology, and the philosophy of science. While some argue that miracles should not be dismissed outright, Hume's challenge forces us to critically evaluate extraordinary claims before accepting them as truth. The problem of infinite regress occurs when an argument, explanation, or justification requires an infinite chain of reasoning, making it impossible to arrive at a solid basis. This problem appears in epistemology, metaphysics, and logic whenever a claim requires further justification that in turn requires another justification, and so on indefinitely. An example in epistemology is the question, how do you know that X is true? If the answer is because yes, then we ask, how do you know that yes is true? And the chain continues infinitely unless a stopping point is found. Without a final justification, it would be impossible to establish knowledge. In metaphysics, the problem of the first cause illustrates this dilemma. If everything must have a cause, then each cause must in turn have a cause, which leads to an infinite regress. Some propose that a first uncaused cause, such as God or the Big Bang, is necessary to avoid this endless chain. There are three common answers to the problem of infinite regress. Foundationalism holds that some basic beliefs or principles are self-evident and require no further justification. Coherentism suggests that beliefs can justify each other in a network structure rather than in a linear chain. And infinitism The least popular opinion accepts that justification can continue infinitely without the need for an ultimate foundation. The problem of infinite regression highlights the fundamental challenges of rational justification, causality, and the nature of explanation in philosophy, science, or logic. It raises the question, where does justification ultimately stop? The Raven paradox, formulated by Carl Gustav Hempel, is a logical puzzle from the philosophy of science that questions how we confirm general claims through observation. It arises from the problem of inductive reasoning, how we justify general scientific laws based on specific observations. Hempel starts from a general statement, all ravens are black. This means that every time we observe a black raven, we obtain evidence that confirms the statement. However, according to the principle of contraposition in logic, this statement is equivalent to all things that are not black are not ravens. If this is true, every time we observe an object that is not black and is not a raven, such as a red apple, a blue car, or a white shirt, we also confirm the original statement. This leads to the paradoxical conclusion that seeing a green tree provides evidence that all ravens are black. The paradox challenges our intuition about scientific reasoning. Although logically valid, the idea that looking at objects that have no relation to ravens can confirm a statement about ravens seems absurd. Some answers suggest that not all evidence should have the same weight or that relevance matters in scientific confirmation. The Raven paradox remains an important problem in confirmation theory, forcing us to reconsider what is considered valid evidence in scientific research. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a cognitive bias whereby people with little skill in a given area tend to overestimate their competence, while highly skilled people tend to underestimate theirs. This psychological phenomenon was identified by David Dunning and Justin Kruger, who discovered that people with limited knowledge often lack the awareness to recognize their own shortcomings. The core of the effect is the idea that ignorance breeds overconfidence. Incompetent people do not realize how little they know and, therefore, assume that they are more capable than they really are. Conversely, experts often underestimate their abilities because they are more aware of the complexities involved and assume that others understand as much as they do. This creates an ironic effect. Those who know the least often think they know the most, while those who actually have knowledge tend to doubt themselves. This bias has widespread implications in education, politics, business, and decision-making. It explains why unqualified people sometimes assume leadership roles with unjustified confidence, why conspiracy theorists believe they have deep knowledge that experts lack, and why students may believe they understand the material better than they actually do. Overcoming the Dunning-Kruger effect requires self-awareness, humility, and continuous learning. Recognizing our own limitations is key to avoiding erroneous decision-making and fostering real intellectual growth. The effect serves as a reminder that true wisdom lies in understanding how much we do not know. The Munchausen trilemma is a philosophical problem that reveals the difficulty of providing an absolute justification for any belief or claim. It is named after Baron Munchausen, who supposedly pulled himself out of a swamp by pulling his own hair. The trilemma suggests that any attempt to justify knowledge inevitably leads to one of three unsatisfactory outcomes: infinite regress, circular reasoning, or axiomatic assumptions. The first option, infinite regress, means that every justification requires another justification, leading to an endless chain with no final foundation. If we ask, why is X true, and answer, because why, then we must ask, why is Y true, and so on forever. The second option, circular reasoning, occurs when a claim justifies itself in some way. For example, by defining a word using the word itself, or by saying my reasoning is reliable because I have reason that it is. The third option, axiomatic assumptions, involve accepting some basic belief or principle without justification, treating it as self-evident or unquestionable. The Munchausen trilemma challenges the idea that knowledge can be fully justified in a fundamental way. It forces philosophers to consider whether we should simply accept some starting points without evidence or whether alternative methods, such as coherentism, in which beliefs support each other in a network structure, can provide a solution. This trilemma remains central in epistemology, reminding us that certainty in knowledge may always be an illusion. Ontological nihilism is the radical metaphysical view that composite objects, things made up of parts, do not really exist. According to this perspective, only fundamental or simple particles exist, while what we call objects are just convenient ways of talking about groupings of these basic elements. For example, a table does not exist in the strict sense. What we call a table is just a collection of atoms arranged in a particular way. Nihilists argue that wholes do not exist. Only the parts exist. This means that everyday objects, from chairs to planets and human beings, are just an illusion of language and not independent real entities. This view challenges common sense ontology, the belief that objects exist as distinct entities. It also poses difficulties for concepts such as personal identity. If a person is just a collection of particles, can we really say that we exist as a unified self? Some philosophers propose a compromise called Mariological universalism, which holds that any collection of objects can be considered a whole, which means that a person and a pile of rocks are equally valid things. Mariological nihilism remains controversial because it contradicts everyday experience and raises profound questions about universalism, which holds that any collection of objects can be considered a whole, meaning that a person and random pile of stones are equally valid things. Mariological nihilism remains controversial because it contradicts everyday experience and raises profound questions about the nature of existence. If everything is reducible to its smallest parts, does anything really exist beyond those parts? This debate continues in metaphysics and the philosophy of language, questioning how we define reality itself. The tragedy of the commons describes a situation in which individuals, acting in their own interest, deplete a shared resource, ultimately harming everyone, including themselves. This concept, popularized by Garrett Hardin in 1968, illustrates how collective resources, such as land, water, air, or fishing, can be overexploited when individuals do not regulate their consumption. Let's imagine a group of farmers who share a communal pasture. If each farmer adds more animals to graze, they personally benefit from the increase in production. However, if everyone follows this logic, the pasture will be overexploited and end up destroyed, leaving resources for nobody. This same principle applies to environmental issues such as climate change, overfishing, deforestation, and air pollution. Each person or company may believe that their individual contribution to the problem is small, but when multiplied by the entire population, effects are catastrophic. Solutions to the tragedy of the commons include government regulation, privatization, and community management. Some argue that state intervention is necessary to protect resources, while others suggest that local communities, given clear ownership and responsibility, can sustainably manage shared resources. The paradox highlights the tension between individual freedom and collective responsibility, reminding us that, without cooperation or regulation, shared resources inevitably deplete. Panpsychism is the philosophical view that consciousness is a fundamental characteristic of the universe and is present in some form in all things, even inanimate objects like rocks, atoms, or entire galaxies. Unlike materialism, which holds that consciousness arises solely from complex brain activity, panpsychism suggests that mental qualities exist at all levels of reality, not just in animals or humans. This idea has ancient roots in Eastern philosophy, Stoicism, and the metaphysics of Spinoza, but has gained new relevance in modern debates about consciousness. Traditional neuroscience has difficulty explaining how subjective experience arises from purely physical processes, a mystery known as the hard problem of consciousness. Panpsychism offers a radical solution by proposing that consciousness does not need to be produced, but exists everywhere in varying degrees. There are several versions of panpsychism. Micropsychism suggests that fundamental particles, like electrons, have primitive forms of consciousness that combine to create human experience. Cosmopsychism, on the other hand, argues that the entire universe is a single unified conscious entity. Critics argue that panpsychism is unscientific or meaningless, as it does not explain how small conscious entities combine into the unified experience of a human mind. Others see it as a compelling alternative to the limitations of materialistic explanations. Panpsychism challenges the conventional division between mind and matter, suggesting that consciousness may be as fundamental as space, time, and energy. If this were true, this vision could radically reshape our understanding of reality, intelligence, and even the very nature of life. Terror management theory, TMT, is a psychological and philosophical framework that explains how humans cope with the awareness of their own mortality, developed by Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Piskaczynski. TMT argues that much of human behavior, our beliefs, values, and cultural systems, arises from a deep need to manage the existential terror of death. Unlike animals, humans have the unique ability to anticipate our own demise, and this creates an existential anxiety that we alleviate through symbolic immortality. The idea that we can continue to live through religion, culture, achievements, or contributions to society. Many belief systems, like religion and nationalism, provide people with a sense of belonging and purpose, helping them cope with the inevitability of death. Experiments with TMT have shown that, when people are reminded of death, they become more defensive of their cultural values, more likely to conform to social norms, and more hostile toward outsiders. This suggests that the fear of death profoundly influences human behavior, shaping politics, morality, and even self-esteem. The theory has important implications for understanding why people cling to ideologies, why conflicts arise between groups, and how humans construct meaning in an indifferent universe, whether through religion, legacy, or achievements. TMT suggests that much of what we do is an unconscious attempt to transcend our own mortality. Quantum superposition in philosophy. It is one of the strangest concepts in physics, but it also has profound philosophical implications about reality, observation, and consciousness. According to quantum mechanics, a particle, such as an electron, does not exist in a single state, but in multiple possible states at once until measured. This idea is famously illustrated with Schrödinger's cat, a thought experiment in which a cat in a box is both alive and dead at the same time until observed. This concept raises disturbing questions about the nature of reality. If observation determines an outcome, does reality exist independently of observation? Some interpretations, such as the Copenhagen interpretation, suggest that reality remains undefined until an observer measures it. Others, such as the many-world interpretation, propose that all possible outcomes actually occur in separate parallel universes, meaning that there is a universe in which the cat lives and another in which it dies. Philosophers and scientists have debated whether quantum mechanics implies that consciousness plays a role in shaping reality. If measurement collapses superposition, does that mean that the act of observing itself creates reality? This idea has led to connections with idealism, panpsychism, and even simulation theory. Quantum superposition challenges determinism, objectivity, and materialism, forcing us to reconsider whether reality is fixed or fundamentally determined by observation. If reality is not absolute, but a set of probabilities, then the world may be much stranger than we had ever imagined. The debate between egoism and altruism revolves around whether human behavior is fundamentally motivated by self-interest or by genuine concern for others. Egoism argues that people act primarily out of self-interest, whether consciously or unconsciously. Altruism, on the other hand, suggests that people are capable of acting for the benefit of others, even at the cost of their own interest. Psychological egoism, advocated by thinkers such as Thomas Hobbes, argues that all human actions, however selfless they may seem, are ultimately driven by self-benefit. Even acts of kindness, like donating to charity or saving a stranger, are said to arise from hidden motives such as personal satisfaction, social approval, or long-term benefit. Ethical egoism, a related but distinct position, suggests that people should act in their own interest because, ultimately, that benefits society. Altruism challenges this view by asserting that genuine generosity is indeed possible. Thinkers such as David Hume and Peter Singer argue that human beings have natural empathy and can act purely for the good of others. Evolutionary biology also suggests that altruistic behavior, like helping relatives or members of a social group, increases the survival of genes, making it an adaptive trait. The tension between egoism and altruism raises fundamental moral questions. Are human beings by nature selfish? Is helping others truly selfless? Should we prioritize our own well-being or the common good? This debate influences ethics, psychology, and economics, determining our understanding of human motivation and moral responsibility. Responsibility. The Chinese room argument. The Chinese room argument, proposed by John Searle, is a thought experiment questioning whether artificial intelligence, AI, can truly understand or have consciousness. It is designed as a critique of strong AI, which claims a computer can have a mind and genuinely understand language. Searle asks us to imagine a person inside a closed room who does not understand Chinese. This person receives Chinese symbols as input and follows a book of rules written in English telling him how to manipulate and return the correct Chinese symbols as output. From the outside, it seems the person understands Chinese, but in reality, he is only following syntactic rules without any real understanding. Searle argues that this is exactly how AI works. It processes symbols, follows rules, and produces answers, but it doesn't really understand the meaning. Computers, however sophisticated, only manipulate symbols syntactically based on the structure, instead of semantically based on the meaning. Therefore, even if a machine passes the Turing test, convincingly simulating human conversation, that does not mean it possesses real consciousness or understanding. Critics of this argument, such as Daniel Dennett, argue that the human brain itself is just a complex system that processes information in a very similar way to a computer, and that understanding could arise from complex calculations. Others propose that AI could reach consciousness through deeper machine learning or neural networks. The Chinese room argument remains a key topic in the philosophy of mind, artificial intelligence, and cognitive science, raising the question of whether machines can really think or if they're just advanced manipulators of symbols. Compatibilism. Compatibilism is the philosophical view that free will and determinism can coexist, while determinism suggests that all events, including human actions, are caused by previous events and natural laws. Compatibilists argue that this does not eliminate human freedom, but redefines free will as acting in accordance with one's own desires and reasoning without external coercion. Philosophers such as David Hume and Daniel Dennett support compatibilism, arguing that free will does not require absolute independence from causality, but simply the ability to act in accordance with one's internal motivations. According to this point of view, a person who makes a decision remains free as long as their decision reflects their own beliefs and desires, even if those desires have been shaped by previous causes. Critics argue that if our decisions are determined by factors beyond our control, then they are not truly free. The debate between compatibilists and incompatibilists remains fundamental in debates about moral responsibility, law, and human agency. Logical positivism is a philosophical movement that affirms that only claims that can be empirically verified or logically demonstrated have meaning. Originating from the Vienna Circle in the early 20th century, thinkers such as A.J. Ayer and Rudolf Carnap argued that claims about metaphysics, ethics, and theology are meaningless unless they can be proven through observation or mathematical demonstration. This approach is based on the principle of verification, which holds that a claim only makes sense if it is analytically true, that is true by definition, such as all bachelors are bachelors, or empirically verifiable, that is demonstrable through observation, such as water boils at 100 degrees C. Claims about the supernatural, morality, or subjective experiences are dismissed as absurd or unscientific. Logical positivism dominated early analytical philosophy, but faced criticism for being self-refuting, since the principle of verification itself cannot be empirically verified. Despite its decline, it shaped the modern philosophy of science and continues to influence debates about knowledge, truth, and scientific reasoning. The ontological shock occurs when a person encounters information that radically challenges their understanding of reality, forcing them to rethink fundamental beliefs. This experience can arise from scientific discoveries, philosophical revelations, or personal transformations that alter their worldview. Some examples of ontological shock are discovering that the Earth is not the center of the universe, realizing the vast implications of quantum mechanics, or facing the idea that free will may not exist. Encounters with artificial intelligence, extraterrestrial life, or near-death experiences also provoke profound existential crises that lead people to question the nature of existence, consciousness, and meaning. Philosophers and psychologists consider ontological shock to be both disorienting and transformative, since, while it can lead to existential fear, it can also foster intellectual growth, resilience, and new philosophical perspectives. It highlights the fragile nature of human perception and reminds us that reality may be much stranger than we assume. Gödel's incompleteness theorems, developed by Kurt Gödel in 1931, revolutionized mathematics and logic by demonstrating that no formal system can be complete and consistent at the same time. These theorems challenge the idea that mathematical truths can be completely demonstrated using a fixed set of logical rules. The first theorem states that any sufficiently complex mathematical system contains true statements that cannot be demonstrated within the system itself. This means that, however advanced our mathematical framework may be, there will always be truths that lie beyond formal proof. The second theorem goes further and shows that no system can demonstrate its own consistency, which means that we can never be absolutely sure that a logical system is free of contradictions. Gödel's work shattered the hopes of mathematical foundationalism, in particular David Hilbert's goal of creating a complete and autonomous mathematical system. These theorems also have profound implications for artificial intelligence, philosophy, and the limits of human knowledge, as they suggest that some truths may remain forever beyond formal reasoning. The Frankfurt cases, introduced by philosopher Harry Frankfurt in 1969, question the idea that moral responsibility requires the ability to act otherwise. It was traditionally believed that if a person could not have acted otherwise, they could not be held morally responsible. Frankfurt's thought experiments suggest otherwise. One scenario involves a person, Jones, who decides to commit an action, for example, to press a button. Without him knowing, a neuroscientist has implanted a device in his brain that would force him to press the button if he were about to choose otherwise. However, Jones freely chooses to press the button, so the device is never activated, although he could not have done otherwise, since the device ensured the result. Jones continued to act of his own free will. The Frankfurt cases support compatibilism, the view that free will and determinism can coexist. They suggest that moral responsibility does not depend on alternative possibilities, but on whether an action stems from one's own reasoning. This challenges libertarian free will and remains fundamental in debates about agency, ethics, and determinism. The evolutionary argument against naturalism, developed by Alvin Plantinga, argues that if naturalism and evolution are both true, we have no reason to trust our cognitive faculties, which leads to a self-defeating position. Evolution selects for survival and reproduction, but not necessarily for truth. If false beliefs provide an adaptive advantage, such as early humans believing in non-existent predators and remaining cautious, then our beliefs may not be reliable indicators of reality. If evolution does not guarantee truth-tracking faculties, then belief in naturalism itself, the opinion that only the physical world is questionable. This argument challenges scientific realism and naturalistic explanations for human reason. Critics argue that, while evolution may not guarantee perfect knowledge, it produces cognitive faculties reliable enough for research and survival. Others claim that rational thought arises from the cumulative selection of abilities for problem-solving. The Eon remains an important philosophical challenge that questions whether human reason can be trusted in a purely naturalistic framework or whether a theistic explanation is necessary for true rationality. The Cartesian theater is a metaphor coined by Daniel Dennett to criticize the traditional view of consciousness, which suggests that there is a central place in the brain where experiences are reproduced for an internal observer. This idea originates in the dualism of René Descartes, which implies that the mind is separate from the body and that there is a self that observes sensory stimuli, like an audience watching a movie. Dennett argues that this model is deeply wrong. Neuroscience demonstrates that there is no single place in the brain where all information converges before becoming conscious. Instead, consciousness arises from distributed neural processes that function simultaneously without any central observer. This leads to Dennett's multiple drafts model, which suggests that our experiences are constantly revised and edited by different parts of the brain rather than being presented in a single theater of mind. The Cartesian theater remains a key concept in debates about the nature of consciousness, highlighting the illusion that there is a single self within our brain that observes how reality unfolds. The extended mind hypothesis, proposed by Andy Clark and David Chalmers, argues that the mind is not limited to the brain, but extends to the external world through tools, technology, and environment. If external objects play a fundamental role in cognitive processes, they should be considered part of the mind itself. A classic example is notebooks or smartphones. If a person with memory loss depends on a notebook to store important information, then that notebook functions as an extension of their mind. Similarly, when people use calculators, GPS devices, or even social interactions to process information, these tools become part of their cognitive system. This challenges traditional views of cognition as something that occurs solely in the brain, instead suggesting that thought and memory can be distributed through external systems. Critics argue that external tools are mere auxiliaries and not real parts of cognition. However, proponents argue that if something actively participates in thinking, it should be considered part of the thinking process itself. The extended mind hypothesis has important implications for artificial intelligence, neuroscience, and human-computer interaction, as it redefines how we define cognitive limits and intelligence. Phenomenology is a philosophical approach that studies how we experience reality from a first-person perspective, rather than focusing on objective facts. Phenomenology explores consciousness, perception, and lived experience, asking what it means to be aware of something. Founded by Edmund Husserl, phenomenology seeks to describe experiences as they present themselves, free from interpretations or assumptions. For example, instead of asking what a tree is in a scientific sense, a phenomenologist asks what the experience of a tree is like. This shift moves philosophy away from external reality and closer to the structure of subjective experience. Martin Heidegger, student of Hill, expanded phenomenology to existentialism, exploring concepts such as authenticity and time. Later, thinkers such as Jean-Paul Sartre and Maurice Merleau-Ponty applied phenomenology to embodiment, individuality, and freedom. Phenomenology remains influential in psychology, cognitive science, and artificial intelligence, as it challenges us to understand the world not only as it exists, but as it is perceived and lived. The Gavagai problem, introduced by Willard Van Orman Quine, is a challenge in linguistics and the philosophy of language that questions how we determine the meaning of words when we learn new language. It highlights the difficulty of translating words without assuming hidden meanings. Imagine an anthropologist encountering a foreign tribe and hearing a native point to a rabbit while saying Gavagai. The anthropologist might assume it means rabbit, but it could also mean animal, food, white fur, thing that moves, or even spirit of the rabbit. Without more context, it is impossible to determine the exact meaning. This problem challenges the idea that words have fixed meanings independent of interpretation. It suggests that language learning is based on context, cultural background, and assumptions, making translation a more uncertain and complex process than we often believe. The Gavagai problem remains fundamental to semantics, artificial intelligence, and cognitive science, highlighting that meaning is not limited to words, but also to the frameworks we use to interpret them. The argument of moral disagreement suggests that the persistence of deep moral disagreements between cultures and individuals challenges the idea of objective moral truths. If morality were objective, like mathematics or physics, we would expect widespread agreement. Instead, history shows persistent conflicts over issues such as human rights, ethical values, and justice. Moral relativists use this argument to argue that morality is subjective, shaped by culture, personal perspective, and history. They argue that moral truths are not absolute, but socially constructed and influenced by factors such as environment and education. However, moral realists argue that disagreement does not imply the absence of objective truth. The fact that people disagree about scientific facts does not mean that those facts do not exist. Some claim that moral truths exist independently of human opinion, but people struggle to recognize them due to biases, misinformation, or self-interests. The argument of moral disagreement continues being fundamental in metaethics that gives form to the debates on if morality is an objective reality or a human invention. The Gaia hypothesis, proposed by James Lovelock in the decade of 1970, suggests that the Earth functions as a self-regulated living system that maintains the favorable conditions for life. This idea challenges the traditional visions of the Earth as a passive environment and proposes, instead, that the biological and geological systems interact to stabilize the planet. A key example is how plants and microorganisms help regulate atmospheric oxygen. Without life, oxygen levels could fluctuate drastically, making Earth uninhabitable. Similarly, the salinity of the ocean has remained remarkably stable during millions of years in spite of processes that should have made it too salty for life, what suggests that living organisms play a role in the maintenance of the balance. The critics argue that the Gaia hypothesis exaggerates the capacity of the Earth to self-regulate, pointing out that life is vulnerable to the mass extinctions and to the climatic changes. However, modern science of the terrestrial system incorporates aspects of that hypothesis, recognizing that life and the environment evolve together in complex feedback loops. The Gaia hypothesis continues being influential in the ecology, the science of the climate, and the sustainability, fostering a holistic vision of the Earth as an interconnected system instead of a mere collection of separate parts. The biological naturalism of Sir, proposed by John Sull, maintains that the conscience is as much a biological phenomenon as irreducible to purely physical explanations, unlike the materialists that affirm that the conscience is no more. That cerebral activity, and the dualists that believe that the mind and the body are separated, Sull maintains that the conscience emerges from the biological processes of the brain, but cannot be explained completely in purely computational or physical terms. Sull rejects the strong AI, arguing that no digital system can understand or truly experience the conscience because the computation by itself does not produce subjective conscience. He sees the conscience as a property of superior order of the biological systems, like the way in which the liquidity of the water arises from molecular interactions. Molecular interactions of the water. However, he insists that consciousness remains entirely natural, not supernatural or mysterious, but simply something we do not yet fully understand. The critics argue that the vision of Sir does not explain clearly how the neuronal activity produces the subjective experience. In spite of this, his theory continues being influential in the debates on the relations between the mind and the body, the artificial intelligence, and the nature of the subjective experience. Hyperobjects, a concept developed by Timothy Morton, refer to entities that are so vast in time and space that they exceed the human perception and control. Examples include climate change, global capitalism, the internet, and nuclear radiation. These objects exist around us, but they're difficult to understand in their totality because they are too big, they are too distributed, or they are too complex so that a single perspective can encompass them. A key characteristic of hyperobjects is that they persist across enormous timescales. Climate change, for example, unfolds over centuries, yet its effects are immediate. Another characteristic is that they envelop everything. The human beings form part of the hyperobjects, but we cannot escape from their influence, just like each breath contains molecules of past centuries. The hyperobjects challenge the traditional philosophical ideas on the human agency, the ethics, and the reality, suggesting that we must rethink our role in a world molded by forces that escape to the individual control. They are fundamental in debates on ecology, technology, and the Anthropocene, forcing us to confront the overwhelming magnitude of modern global challenges. The paradox of the fiction. Paradox of the fiction asks why we feel real emotions for fictional characters and events, in spite of the fact that we know that they are not real. This paradox arises because, logically, the emotions are based normally on beliefs on the reality. But the people cry with the tragic films, fear the monsters of the horror films, or feel joy when the character of their favorite book is successful. The paradox has three contradictory ideas. 1. We only feel emotions for things that we believe that are real. 2. We know that the fictional characters and events are not real. 3. However, we continue experiencing genuine emotions towards them. Several theories attempt to resolve this. The theory of the simulation suggests that we do not feel real emotions, but that we simulate them. The thought theory argues that imagining a situation is enough to unleash real emotional responses. Others affirm that the emotions arise because the fiction connects with universal human experiences, what makes it psychologically real, although it is not physically real. The paradox of the fiction continues being fundamental in the aesthetics, the psychology, and the studies of the media, and raises questions on how the imagination and the emotions interact. The scandal of induction. The scandal of the induction refers to the ancient problem of the philosophy of the science on why the inductive reasoning works in spite of not having logical guarantee. Raised for the first time by David Hume, the problem arises because inductive reasoning, which extracts general conclusions from past observations, is based on the supposition that the future will resemble the past. However, there is no logical proof that this assumption is always true. For example, we assume that sun will rise tomorrow because it always has done it, but logically, the past events do not guarantee the future results. This leads to a paradox. We justify the induction, pointing out its success in the past, but that in itself is an inductive argument. What converts it into a circular reasoning? Philosophers have tried to solve this problem in diverse ways. Karl Popper proposed falsificationism, according to which scientific theories are not proven by demonstrating their truth, but by attempting to refute them. Others maintain that the induction works in a pragmatic way. That is, it is useful, although we cannot justify it formally. The scandal of the induction continues being one of the biggest challenges of the epistemology and the philosophy of the science, since it questions if the human knowledge is based on the certainty or simply on practical habits. Moral dumbfounding. The moral dumbfounding refers to situations in which the people firmly believe that something is morally incorrect, but have difficulties to justify it when they're asked to provide a logical reasoning. The psychologist Jonathan Hay and his colleagues popularized the concept by means of experiments that show that the people usually base on their instincts more than on rational arguments at the time of issuing moral judgments. For example, in a study, situations were presented to the participants harmless but taboo, like a brother and a sister that maintained consenting but secret incestuous relations, and without consequences. The majority of people immediately judged the act as incorrect, but it cost them to explain why, often resorting to phrases like, "It simply seems bad to me." This suggests that the moral reasoning is often post hoc, what means that the people form emotional reactions and then try to justify them with a logic. The moral dumbfounding challenges the idea that morality is purely rational and supports the moral intuitionism, that maintains that the deeply rooted emotions and the social conditioning mold the moral beliefs more than the logical analysis. The concept has implications for the ethics, the psychology, and the political speech, since it highlights how the moral judgments often go beyond the rational argumentation. The Boltzmann brain hypothesis is a paradox of cosmology and statistical mechanics that questions whether it is more likely that the universe we experience is real, or whether we're just disembodied brains floating in a vast chaotic cosmos. The idea comes from the work of Ludwig Boltzmann on entropy and randomness in the universe. According to thermodynamics, random fluctuations in an infinite or long-lived universe can, given enough time, produce complex structures by pure chance. If the universe is truly infinite, then it should be much more likely that a single brain with false memories forms spontaneously in the vacuum than for an entire ordered universe to exist through gradual cosmic evolution. If this were true, it would mean that our reality, our memories, and everything we experience could be an illusion formed by chance, rather than physical laws. The Boltzmann brain paradox raises fundamental questions about the reliability of perception, the nature of consciousness, and the fine-tuning of the universe. Most physicists reject the idea, arguing that if we were only Boltzmann brains, our experiences would be much more chaotic and meaningless than they seem. However, the paradox remains a challenge that makes us reflect on our assumptions about existence and probability in an infinite cosmos. Deontic logic is a branch of logic that examines obligations, permissions, and prohibitions, providing a structured way to analyze moral and legal reasoning. Unlike classical logic, which focuses on truth and falsehood, deontic logic deals with what should be done. It evaluates claims such as one must tell the truth or it is forbidden to steal, helping philosophers and ethicists formalize ethical debates. This logic assigns specific symbols to different types of normative statements. For example, obligations are represented as necessary actions, while permissions indicate options that are permitted but not mandatory. This framework is widely used in moral philosophy, legal theory, and artificial intelligence, especially in the programming of ethical algorithms for autonomous systems. However, deontological logic also faces paradoxes, such as contradictory moral duties, in which one obligation contradicts another. Questions arise about whether absolute moral rules can exist, or whether ethical decisions should always depend on the context. Deontological logic remains a fundamental tool for understanding moral responsibility and ethical decision-making, offering a precise method for debating normative principles in law, ethics, and philosophy. The dirty hands problem is a moral dilemma that explores whether individuals, particularly leaders, may be justified in committing immoral actions for the sake of a greater good. It appears in politics, war, and governance, where decisions often involve choosing between two morally problematic outcomes. The philosopher Michael Walzer describes this problem in situations in which political leaders must engage in morally questionable acts, such as lying, manipulating, or even resorting to violence to protect society or achieve a noble goal. A common example is whether torturing a terrorist to prevent an attack is fair and justifiable, while torture is widely condemned. Allowing mass casualties may seem like the greater evil, creating an ethical paradox in which both options are morally tainted. This dilemma challenges deontological ethics, which insists on absolute moral rules, while aligning more with consequentialism, which evaluates morality based on outcomes. It raises profound questions about whether morality should remain rigid in extreme situations, or whether ethical flexibility is sometimes necessary. The dirty hands problem remains a central issue in political philosophy, ethics, and real-world decision-making, forcing society to confront the moral costs of leadership and governance.